I'm Ryan, and today we are going to work on an acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, let's jump into it. For this lesson, I'm going to be using a 16 by 20 inch canvas, and I decided to go with a significantly larger canvas for this lesson just because the additional space will make adding all of those little details a lot easier. So we're going to begin here today with a 1 inch flat-headed brush. I'm going to dip it in a little bit of water, make sure that it's nice and damp to extend the wet life of our paint. Then I'll grab quite a bit of titanium white and just a hint here of Mars black. Maybe about 1/8. We'll mix that together. I'll grab a very small amount of our cerulean blue, about an equal mixture to that of the black. And this will be our highlight for our sky right down here. Now I'm going to try to make sure that this is a nice thick application. So I'm not going to spread it too far. And I'm using this 1 inch flat-headed brush because it allows me to work with a fairly sharp edge, as you can see around the buildings, and because it can carry a good amount of pigment. Now I'm starting to get a bit of a toothy look, so I don't want to continue spreading that pigment. Instead, I'm going to go back and grab some more. As you can see, I went over the majority of the light posts, but I'll keep this one because it's larger, and we can just incorporate the others in a little bit. Here I'm going over those edges, making sure they're fairly sharp, but they don't have to be absolutely perfect. Then, make it slightly brighter. We'll just come back over that bottom again, and I'm going to work my way up a couple of times. Now I want this piece to be a bit more loose and impressionistic, so I'm not going to worry about creating perfect blends here. I'm just going to get a general transition. And I may actually come back later and make it a bit more blocky. Then we're going to make it slightly darker, so a hint more Mars black, a hint more blue. Mix that together, make it nice and even on the brush. And here on the palette, we can start applying that up here. You can see that I have a streak of blue. That actually occurred because it wasn't blended perfectly here on the mix and palette, so just something to watch out for. That said, again, we do want this to be a bit more of a loose painting, so I'm not too concerned. I am making it a bit darker as we get higher up here in the sky. There we go. That's a nice and moody color for our rainy day. And yet again, cutting along the sharp edges, like so. You can also bring this down below that lamp post. There we go. And continue working our way up. See how I'm rotating the brush for those angular marks? Now again, right here is where we're generally going to want that smooth gradient. It's the difference between two different values and colors, but I don't want that here. So instead, I'll just take more of that darker pigment, I'll work it down, and I'll just kind of work the two back and forth, generally in horizontal or vertical strokes. And now you can see a couple of brush strokes in there, but it's not too prominent, and you have this feeling that it's lifting upwards. There's these very dominant movements in it, and it just keeps the piece more dynamic in an area that would generally be a bit more still. So we're instilling more interest in something that would be a bit plain. With that said, let's continue finishing up the top, then we can get on to the buildings. So as we continue to move higher, we do make our mixture slightly darker and slightly more blue as well. It's not a great transition, but it's going to give us slightly more of an interest. And if you look at that, there's so much tooth, there's so much canvas showing through, and I just don't have enough paint to properly apply this. So we'll mix more.
I'll mix it on top of / beside our initial mixture, that way I can match them. And here you can see what we're working towards. Here you can see what we currently have, so I can tell that it needs to be darker. So I'll add extra Mars black. I can tell that it needs to be more blue. And we'll just work our way back to that initial pigment. Now, a lot of people initially have troubles with remixing colors after they've kind of accomplished what they want. They run out, and then it's, what do I do? Generally, I advise leaving a bit of that pigment on your palette, just like we have there, and then mixing right beside it until you achieve what you want. And you just need to ask yourself, is it too bright? Is it too dark? Is it too saturated? Is it not saturated enough? And eventually, you don't have to ask any of those questions as you find the answers. So if it needs to be more dark, I add more Mars black. If it needs to be more bright, I add more titanium white. If it needs to be more saturated, I add more blue. If it needs to be less saturated, I add more white and black to make it a bit more gray. And it's essentially just going back with that set of questions until eventually you get what you want. Now here, I'm going to work right behind this pole, work up, and I have a lot of pigment kind of in the middle of the brush, so I'll just work that off. Generally, you don't want pigment to work its way down to the bottom of the bristles because it A, can be quite difficult to clean, but B, can be a little more difficult to work with. So it's something to be avoided, but if you do have that pigment, then you know what, you can use it, you can spread it. You can turn that into a good situation. But as you can see, I'm still just applying all of this, making sure it's nice and thick, and I'm also being relatively loose, as you can tell in this area. If there is an occasional diagonal streak with a bit more saturation, that can actually be quite beautiful. And I like that a lot, so I'm going to keep it. With that, we're going to head back down to the bottom buildings, and we'll proceed from there. So now we're back down to the bottom of the canvas, and here I'm going to mix up some pigment for this cluster of buildings right here. They're a fairly similar distance away, so they're all going to have a similar amount of natural reflected light, so they're going to be quite blue in the distance. Now I'm going to take what we had right here, I'm going to make it slightly darker, and I'll only do this with the bottom portion, that way I have that top area as a reference. And I'm just going to make it more blue and a bit more black. Now I think that's a little stark. We still want a lot of room to make things darker as we get into the foreground. Generally the foreground of your painting is where that high contrast is going to be, where those bright brights and dark darks are. So we need to progressively make things dark. We don't want to do it too quickly. So here I'm just taking some of that darker blue. I'm cutting initially along the edges, and I'm actually going to fill in this set of buildings right here. Now, this is one of those interesting things where we are going to want more detail in this. However, for right now, we're going to keep it simple with this base layer, and then we're going to build on top of it. Yet again, I'm working predominantly in horizontal and vertical strokes. That way, if any show through, you still have these very structural lines that make sense with what we're doing with the buildings. And we're just building this good base. You can go through and really straighten some of these lines, but you can also move these pigments out as well. I'm going to throw some distant buildings here in the real background. And this is essentially the idea that there's a hill and then there's this view of the city that's so much farther away. So I'm going to throw in all of these small buildings. I'm trying to make sure that they're diverse, different sizes, and I'm consistently just looking back at the reference photo to make sure I'm not making things too samey and that things are evolving properly. Generally, when we simply rely on our imagination, we simplify things, and that's not what you want to do with the city scene. The life comes from the complication. Now we're going to move in, and we have two choices here. We can wait for that to dry and get a wet onto dry application, or we can work wet into wet. Wet onto dry will probably give us a slightly more clean look, and we won't have as much of a blend, so we'll get more of that natural pigment that we have on our palette. Or we can blend right now and get something that's a bit more cohesive and soft looking. Because it's the distance, I think I'm going to aim for the cohesive and soft looking. That way it feels like, again, there's more of that atmospheric reflective light. And I'm going to do so now with this 1/4 inch flat-headed brush. I'm going to start by mixing up a brighter version of this blue. So I'll take some extra cerulean blue, some extra titanium white. I'll work those right down here, mixing with our initial color. That way it's cohesive and it doesn't feel like it stands out too much. Generally in the background you want things to be a bit more visually samey. That way you have extra room for a pop in the foreground. And then I'll start applying this to different levels of my building. Thinking about where windows might be, how different portions are connected, and I don't need this all to be perfect. We're trying to make sure that the majority of the edges, initially at least, are a bit more clean. That way these inner areas can be slightly more loose and expressive. Here you can see a hard line, there you can see more of a blend, so we're combining these different techniques. And the more I move this pigment about, the more it's going to run out and the more we're going to see that initial color. So if you want it to be stark again, just grab more from your palette. Bring this down. It's a fairly soft transition. I'm also, again, very frequently looking over at that reference photo and just making sure what I'm doing here aligns with what we have there. Pigment starting to dry, we'll mix up more. Again, using that as a reference. There we go. Now, in the reference photo, I see that there's a really neat area right here with highlight that stretches its way down to the bottom. So I'm just going to try to keep this a relatively straight line. And then I see that it separates, and then there's more here, and this connects the tops of the buildings to the bottom of the buildings in a really neat way. So we're not really trying to paint specific windows or anything like that at this distance, because you don't really see that at this distance. You just see shapes and colors, and that's what we're trying to play with here. And we'll just work in some different levels there. And I think that's nice and interesting. So, from there, we'll start moving on to this next, larger, darker building. So, because we're back to a larger subject, I'm going to switch back to the 1 inch flat-headed brush, and I'm going to, yet again, make sure it's quite damp. I can see the darker colors that we've previously used, and I know that I need this to be the darkest pigment yet. It also needs to be slightly more blue, so I'm going to look at this as reference. Start with some Mars Black, some Cerulean Blue. Oh, that's really pretty. I like that pigment a lot. A little bit of Titanium White. Gray it down just a bit, that way we can save our heavily saturated pigments for the foreground. And that looks perfect to me. I like that. So now we're going to start on the edge here. I always like to begin on the edges because when you have fresh pigment and your brush has recently been made damp, you can make the sharpest strokes. And I'm also going to do a bit of a diagonal line right there to show some depth. That way we have two sides of our building. Then I'll extend it over here. I'm not using the entirety of the head of the brush because it's a little large for that. But we're getting the job done well there. Now as I move down, I am going to move over a portion of that last building. I am okay with that. That's just something to accept. And if we get a nice little blend there, that's nice too. So now, like the last set of buildings, I'm just going to block this in. Not worried about detail, I'm not worried about windows or landings, balconies, any of it. I just want the base of the structure, something to build on. And again, I'm working in almost all vertical strokes. If there are any strokes showing through, I am okay with that. Again, I do want this piece in the end to be a bit more impressionistic. And I know that we're incorporating a lot of structure and clean line into something that will eventually be a bit more loose. But I think the more I've painted impressionistic pieces, the more I've realized that starting with something that does truly look like the subject is a great way of going about it, because then you know where you can make it more loose and you're not kind of tied to the few areas that you did accidentally make look more realistic or sharp. You just have more option in the end. So with that said, I like how that's all turning out right there. I think I'm going to take some of our last highlighted pigment and I'm going to work that down here into the bottom because I can see it on the reference photo. And it makes sense that there's more light right here because there's more light from the actual sky, but there's also more light in the environment. So take some titanium white, Mars black, blue, and it doesn't need to be exactly like our last mixture, though it does seem like we landed on that quite quickly. So you know what, that's great. And I'm just going to do some taps with my brush. Generally it's easier to get a consistent sharp line by creating a myriad of taps than it is by creating an actual drawn line. And that's just a little tip. And I also like the effect and the look it gives too. So with that, let's switch our brushes actually over to the smaller flat-headed brush, just like that. Then we will grab some of our highlight, say, okay, you know what, we'll incorporate two little horizontal applications there. I see it in the reference photo, it's a nice little detail, but it's not too much. And I want to do some of this painting from afar, like you can see right now, and I want to do some of it up close, because I think it's really important to recognize that we shouldn't get lost in the details here. And by looking at it from a distance, you don't kind of visually get caught up in that, and it's not something you have to worry about on that same level. So I think we're just going to do these two for now. We'll keep it simple, and then we'll come back to it in a minute. With that, the building right next to it, right here, is also quite dark. So we'll continue with that. And I'm going to take this as my general base, but we are going to make it slightly darker because as we move into the foreground, we want more and more contrast. So I'll just apply that right there. And as you can see, that's exactly what we don't want. So don't be afraid to mix more pigment because you're going to need to, especially working on a canvas of this size. This is actually a great exercise for getting a lot better at mixing your paints and re-achieving colors, because you'll have to do it quite frequently. And we're working with a very limited palette here, so it's not complicated mixes you have to recreate. It's a good starting point. So here's the second building. It's just as dark. At this point, I'm working now in vertical strokes so that it matches the aesthetic of the last one. And now I'm going to make it darker, so extra Mars black. I'll just take half of the mix rather than the whole one, that way I can compare. See? And I'm looking at the photo, I'm saying, okay, you know what? It starts almost at the top, and then it comes down. And I think I'll actually let it blend there. And then I'll also come back into the side of the building, and I'll do that again. Ideally, there would be a bit of blue in between there, but because we applied as much pressure with our brush as we did, the bristles expanded and we got this larger consistent stroke. Luckily, we know what to do. We just take some extra pigment and we'll re-interject that slight edge that shows that there are two sides to this building. One that's facing this way, one that's facing us. So that is a really good start. I like that building a lot. Now, we're going to get creative. I'm going to get you a lot closer and I'm going to show you a different technique that you can use if you want to, but you don't have to. So, a lot of artists don't actually like to paint cityscapes with brushes. They like to paint them with palette knives because they're longer, they're consistent, they're sharp, and they render sharp edges exceedingly well. Now, I personally like to do a combination. I feel like the brush gives it kind of a wispy, almost whimsical, dreamy feeling to it, where I feel like this creates a lot of structure. That said, you don't need to use this for this next step. You could continue with the smaller flat-headed brush and interject this detail with that in a very similar way to how we just created that line right there. But here I'm actually going to use this. So I'm going to take some titanium white, and you can find a palette knife set on Amazon fairly affordably. I'll include one in the video description. I'm not sponsored or affiliated, but it's a good thing to know about, and generally you can get them much more affordably when you buy them in a pack than if you were to buy them individually. I used to buy them individually for maybe $8 each, and then I found a pack on Amazon for $20, I believe, and it had, I think, 10 of them, so great deal. With that said, I am mixing up a darker blue here. And it's quite easy to peel paint with a palette knife here. It's great for mixing. A lot of artists actually who like to paint with brushes also use palette knives for their mixing. That way they don't get their brushes dirty or full of paint before they go in. And that's also a great technique. So we generally don't use palette knives on the channel because I'm not a big fan of them in general landscapes, but I do think they can be great in something like this. And with that, now I'm going to take it, and you can really apply this on whatever angle you'd like. This palette knife right here is, I believe, about 1/4 of an inch, so not large. But you can see these very sharp applications that just wouldn't be achievable any other way. Oh, that's good. That one's a bit larger. Could have done that one with a brush. Generally, it builds a bit of texture as well, which can be fun if that's something you're interested in. Now, I'm being very careful with this because we are making consistent, longer strokes, and if you do that and you start to move about, then it'll be quite noticeable. And I'm just looking on the reference photo trying to see how far these extend. I'm seeing that there seems to be a bit more over on the side here than over on the right hand side. There we go. Might take a hint of this and work it into this back building as well. And we can throw that really throughout if we want. But definitely a good start, like that. Now, I believe we have another building that cuts right in front of this one, and it's just slightly brighter than the base color that we used for this one. I'm looking to see where it is. I believe it starts right here. It interrupts some of these lines, which is good because it shows additional depth. And then we'll just work that down. And you know what, we'll actually let it get lost down here. So there's a slight blend, but you can still see a hint of a brush stroke in there. If you're having trouble with matching values or making sure that we're progressively changing things, you can always print out the reference photo and test your colors on that. I'm actually doing that with this one, and I just find it an incredibly useful technique. But with that, we're now going to head down into a larger building at the bottom. So now that we're closer here to the street, things are going to get significantly more bright because generally there's a lot more light occurring there, both from the street itself and from the buildings. So with that, I am going back to the 1-inch flat-headed brush, and I want to remix this color and value. So I know that I have it on my palette. I think it's that one, but I'm not entirely sure. So I'll start by mixing to that. As you can see, lots of titanium white, bit of Mars black to bring down that saturation and value. And as you can see, we went a little bit dark there. So more titanium white to brighten it up, but as we add more titanium white to a predominantly Mars black mixture, we of course get more gray, so now we need to resaturate it with cerulean blue. So we're just working back and forth until we get what we want. And that's a little bit brighter, but it's quite close. I'll test it on my reference photo, and I like that. So now I'm going to start with this larger diagonal line. Then I will work on my edge. Then I will bring all of that inwards. And this will be a fairly bright side of our building. And we will incorporate a lot of detail into this one because we're getting closer to the foreground, and that's where this all starts to get visible. So with that, now this side is going to be darker. Grab Mars black, like that. Grab some cerulean blue. Test on our photo. Good. And you're not always going to get an exact match for your reference photo initially. It is something that takes time, but I think light singing or really any other skill like that, at a point it becomes intuitive. So just keep doing it, and eventually you'll be able to mix the colors you see quite quickly. And the reference photo test is really just there to be a test, to make sure that you're getting what you want. So with that, really, really happy with what we have there. I'm going to have an option. I can go in with either of these, and you know what, we did the last set of detail with the palette knife. Let's do this set of detail with the smaller brush. That way, again, you do see that it's something you can go back and forth with. And I'll actually take the highlight that we used for the last one. And here we're going to be creating some line work. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to the edge, and then I'm working my way this way. But as you can see, I'm not dragging. I'm making a series of taps. The pigment is blending with the pigment that we previously applied. Doesn't have to. Remember, you can let it dry and then get more of this natural pigment, but because it is farther away, that's not really what I want right now. Make sure that this is slowly getting more towards a flat line at the bottom here. It should be flat because it's just about on that horizon, and we're really trying to create a transition up into that slant. Now you don't need to fill in all of these. I can see them all in the reference photo, but if you painted exactly to the reference photo, it wouldn't be all that impressionistic, right? That said, I did Photoshop the reference photo to be a bit more impressionistic, just to visualize it preemptively, make it a bit easier. So I am going to be a bit more playful here. I'll leave the ones in the center slightly more transparent and blended. And this area is creating light. It's pushing light this way, right? So I'm going to highlight the edge of the building slightly as well. Here, more of a tap. And this is a incredibly simple building. If I were getting tongue twisted. If I were to encourage you to make sure that you are avoiding something while painting a cityscape, it's not to paint every building the same way. Don't do that. Make sure that they're different, make sure that they're evolving, check your reference photo, go out, look at buildings. This is a very simple building, and it is not an example of every building. So just keep that in the back of your head. With that, I'm going to move a bit of that highlight inwards on those diagonal strokes, and that's going to give it a bit more of a painterly and impressionistic effect. I think that's all I want to do though. I might create some applications here. I can see that this is actually from a different building, but I want to make this color a bit more cohesive. And I like that loose brush stroke there. I'm also going to take more of that mixture, and now we'll work it on the back side of the building. Now this isn't going to be on an angle because it's facing us. And what we're looking for here is actually just going to be a series of horizontal lines that connect to our diagonal lines from the other side of the building. See that? I'm actually going to go in and make them a bit brighter, but because I know this painting is going to take hours upon hours and I don't want to make the video too long for you, I'm actually going to go ahead and do this myself. And then I will see you for the next building. So as you can see, I heightened all of the values in those highlights, but now I'm going to take some of that highlight that we were working with. I'm going to take a bit of that darker pigment, create a mix of the two, and I'll just splash in some windows here, or at least openings. And I'm going to jump around quite a bit. That way it looks like there are different amounts of light being emitted, and it makes it a bit more interesting. By applying more pressure, you'll create a larger application, but a more visually notable one. And by creating less pressure, rather applying it, you create a much more transparent application, but one that's sharper and really reflects the size of your brush. Here I have almost no paint left on my brush, but I'm just applying this over some of the regular areas so that places where I don't apply it appear extra dark. See that? Now that looks even darker, as does that. And the bottom should be quite bright because hypothetically there's a lot of light from the street reflecting upon the building itself. So now we're taping with a fairly wide shot because yet again we need to cover a lot of space, and I want to show you what that color looks like in context with the buildings and also the sky. So with that said, covering a lot of area, I'm going back to the 1-inch flat-headed brush. I'm going to take some cerulean blue, titanium white, and we're trying to mix essentially the highlighted pigment we were just working with, and I want something quite similar to that building but a little bit more blue. So we're just going to use less black and white in our mixture, and here, as you can see, looks like we're quite close. I'll test this in a couple of places. One in here, that way we have a bit of that cohesive color. I like that so much that I think I'll actually do a bit more loose strokes. Again, it's impressionistic, so we can just kind of mimic strokes that we had before. Oh, that looks really good. And I'll also test it on my reference photo, which also looks good. It's a little bit brighter than what I have on my reference photo, so I'm going to keep that in mind. Should I feel like I need to darken it, then it kind of reaffirms that idea in my head should I come to that conclusion. But if I like how bright it is, then I'll keep it. So here, I'm just painting the highlighted side of this building, so I'm mapping out the edges, as you can see. I am going to cover portions of this lamp. That's okay. And then we'll fill it in. Really stands out nicely against this darker building, and we're starting to get a nice contrast there. But remember, In general, the bottom of these buildings is going to be the brighter area, so I actually want the top to be darker. So I'll take some, maybe Mars Black, work that into our mixture. There you can see the contrast. I'll apply this at the top, starting with that sharp edge. And then I'll work this down. And something you'll find as you create these various values, that eventually your pigments will look similar to that of the sky. And you might say, oh no, it doesn't stand out. I need it to stand out. I need it to be its own thing and be very visually prominent. Not the case. Sometimes it's honestly best for them to blend a little bit, for some areas to look softer so that other areas can look more prominent. And that's what we're doing here. Yes, it looks similar, but that is not a bad thing. And as we come down, as you can see, we get more and more into that light. And we really want to build a lot of light in this center area. So this looks great so far. Very happy. I'm doing a lot of these vertical strokes. That way if any stroke shows through, it again stays in line with the majority of the stroke and the feeling of the piece. A lot of kind of subconscious leading lines in there, but I'm quite happy with that as a whole. Now I'm going to take a pigment that's really quite similar to what we have up there, might make it a hint darker, and then I'm going to paint the backside of the building. So yet again, what are we doing? We're painting a fairly basic base layer, and then we'll build on top of it with some highlights and details, maybe shadows in a minute. So I'm just going to fill this in and then I'll see you in a second. So as you can see, I filled in the right hand side here of this building, and when I was doing it, I was actually looking at my reference photo, and what I realized was that what I was working on, what I was drawing, what I was painting, it wasn't a single building, it was two. So right here, we have this highlighted side that's facing the street. Then you can see this very subtle strip here where it's darker than that, but it's lighter than that. And this is actually the back of the building. And right here is a new, entirely dark building. Something I wouldn't have thought of, but I love the very small spacing between these two and the way it layers in front. Really interesting. You don't have to do this. You could do a more simplified version for sure. It's just an added detail that I liked a lot. And just so we understand what's happening here, because I think that's so important when you're painting. Not only that you understand how to paint what you're painting, but why you're painting what you're painting. This part of the building right here is brighter because it's facing the street and it's getting more light from the street. But it also is probably a bit more of a populated area in the building, and therefore it's emitting more light. Now we have this strip behind that's relatively light, but it's not as light as this because again it's not getting that same light from the street, but it's also not getting the light from here that's coming forward. Then we have this next building which is actually facing the street, but it's quite dark, and it's only quite dark because the material it's made of is significantly more dark. So it's one of those things where there are these general rules that you think about in terms of light coming from the street, light coming from here, things that are facing the street being brighter, all of that. But then there's also these additional things that, again, a lot of us don't generally think about, in that different materials reflect light in different ways. And sometimes they are brighter and darker than other areas. So I just thought I'd point that out. I also started doing some work like that in the same way that we did the bottom building. I used this 1/2-inch palette knife, but I did want to go back to using the 1/4-inch brush for the majority of it. So here, yet again, we have this. It's quite damp. I'm making a bit of a highlighted version. I actually want something fairly similar to the bottom of the building. So I'll test that. And the beauty of impressionistic work, if you have a couple loose strokes in there, it doesn't look like a bad thing. So you can test on your canvas. Getting very close. And there we go. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to look for the bottom of my street, and I'll move the camera back for you for this. So essentially, here we're going to start plotting on those same movements that we have down here in this building, up in this building. But it's a little bit more tricky because we are dealing with a larger building. So at what trajectory are these supposed to make that change from a horizontal line to one that's quite diagonal? And the easy answer is we can work from the traceable and just trace it on after we've painted it. It's a very easy way of going about it. But if you're not working from the traceable and you want to do it a bit more freehand, you can find a single point here at the back of the road. For me, that's right here, and this is called one-point perspective. It's where a single point in the painting creates the majority of the lines for the painting via perspective, and it just essentially ensures that it's all pretty correct. So you essentially take this line and then you go through all of the tops of the buildings, and that's how you decide what angle they're on. And you can do this quite simply by using a ruler, putting it down here in that corner, moving it through there. You see that that one's correct, then we move it up to there, and you just essentially line it up. The same can be done here through these. So, we can put it in the corner, we can take this highlight, and we can work it through in that way. Now, you can also do it freehand if it's something you feel comfortable with. It's actually what I'm going to do here, but again, if you want to ensure that it's absolutely perfect, you can use the traceable. If you want to get it extremely close, you can use a ruler and one-point perspective. And if you're feeling quite confident, you can do it freehand like I am. And I'm kind of just taking my brush, my hand, I'm going down to the bottom, I'm working up, that way I get a general sense of the direction. And as you can see, the more high up I get, the more notable the pigment is, because we're working on darker pigment the farther we move up. So the highlighted pigment, or rather the neutral pigment, it looks brighter. So there's something to consider. I'm also adding the majority of the highlight to the left-hand side, and then I'm letting it dissipate as you move more towards the right. And here, as we get closer to the bottom, there's less of that change in value, so it's all starting to look a little samey, which isn't a bad thing, and my lines are getting more and more horizontal. Just like that. Now, I know because we're quite far away, difficult to see the actual detail that I'm painting here, but I think the general idea of how we achieve it and those angles is really the most important part. And again, we will do so much more of that up-close detailed work with all of that. But with that said, I do want to work in some windows right here, and they are simply facing us, so we don't have to deal with that perspective. Anything directly facing us doesn't get impacted by that one-point perspective. That's only things that are facing this way, essentially, in the painting. So the sides of buildings and the windows on the sides of the buildings, but everything that's front-facing is significantly more simple in that they have flat tops, as you can see. So here we are, we're a bit closer, and now we can work on some of the windows right in here. For that, I am going to want a bit of a brighter value similar to what we have down there. And for these, I'm actually just going to start by working in those horizontal lines that connect to the diagonal lines that we were working in. Initially, I'll make them a bit more subtle like this, and then for ones that we really like, we can build up with extra highlight, but this is a great way to start. It's just establishing where everything is. Get more pigment. And now I'll go over a couple of those areas. Some of this might still be wet, so you might get a blend. Again, not the worst thing, but it will make your pigment less stark for sure. Really like how this is turning out. I got lucky, and it's also quite a moody, rainy day outside, So it really fits with the vibe of the painting. With that, let's make some of these windows darker and brighter than others. So we get some Mars black, Cerulean blue, titanium white, Mars black. It's darker than the original mix, so that's good. I'll test it on my reference photo over here. Looks good. It's a little bit brighter, but I'm okay with that. If we need to darken it, we can. And yeah, I should have trusted the reference photo. Definitely needs to be darker, and significantly so. So now I'll test this, and that looks so much more correct. So here, we'll just work in some of these window areas. Not all of them. We're working in between the highlighted applications we just did. And this is going to differentiate this side of the building from this side of the building, while also creating some really neat detail. And again, it alludes to life, right? If these are dark, then there isn't anyone there, but if they're light, then someone is. And there's life in that building, and I think that's really, really neat. Let's get a brighter mixture than what we've been working with. Like that. And we can incorporate this, into some of these. But then we'll also use this pigment elsewhere in a second. Just want to make sure it feels right in the painting. Again, it gets lost down here, which is what we want. And then I'll pick a couple windows, and I'll actually give them this incredibly bright pigment. Then I'll work in some of the brighter areas of this building, here along the vertical side, create these applications, and then I'll move that highlight in a couple of areas. They get an extra sheen. Some of it you're going to want to work all the way across, some of it less so. That said, we don't want to make this too bright as a whole because we have so much more to build on. So this is just kind of a treat. It's something to add on top of what we have. So now we're heading back down to the bottom of the painting, and I'm going to work on this building right here and this one because they actually share fairly similar values. So I'm going to start by taking some titanium white, some blue, some Mars black, and right now what we're trying to do is mix something that is just a bit darker than what we have right here. So all of my pigments have essentially dried here on my palette. I took a bit of a lunch break, and I'm now having to remix things, which isn't a bad thing. It instills good practice, and make sure you do remember how to mix those pigments because you do it a couple of times. So I'm just going in and I'm testing this pigment. I can see that it's darker than the bottom area there, and that's exactly what I want. So now we'll start working our way along these edges that are facing the street with this pigment that is bright compared to this and this, but darker compared to that. And this is going to give us room to build highlights on it. It's one of the reasons you generally don't want to build too bright of a base here, because then you just don't have room to brighten it up. And I'm going over the edge a couple of times until I get something fairly straight. Then I'll go over this back edge, and I'm going to be more loose with it because I do need to paint that area, and part of it is going to overlap, so that's something that's easily fixed. And then I'll work my way back into the middle, just like that. Now I'll make sure my brush is still nice and damp. I'll head into this next building right here. Again, same values for the most part. Work our way around this sign, and now that we're getting closer to the foreground, we will get interesting things like signs that'll diversify what we're painting. In the background, it is a little bit visually samey, but that's a good thing because it means it won't demand too much attention. And our foreground can pop the way we want it to. So there's our base. Now we need our darker back layer. Get quite a bit of Mars black, white, blue, blue, white. I like that. Darker than what we have, but not a pure black. And I'll start working this on. Started on the top, going to the edge, and here I have two edges to work with. I am making a stroke, as you can see, but I'm also lifting my brush quite frequently. That way I can come back in and just make it slightly sharper. You can also use green painter's tape if you want to make sure your lines are perfectly sharp. But again, in the end, I do want this to be a bit more impressionistic looking, a bit more loose. So it's not something I'm really concerning myself with too much right here. There. You can see that this kind of blends and the darker area here looks softer than it does at the top. That's actually not a bad thing. It kind of looks like light emitting from that area and it gives it an extra quality to it. So I like what we have there. Now it's time to head in and add some detail. We can do that through a variety of ways with our smaller brush or with our palette knife. I think we'll start with our smaller brush just because it's something we've been using consistently. It's something I know everybody here in the audience has. But we will play more with that palette knife in a little bit. That way you can get acquainted with it. And perhaps excited as well. So I'm starting with a line right there because I can see it in my reference photo. Then I see there are a lot of very long lines going down here. And because I'm working wet into wet, the pigment that I applied at the top and that color right there, it doesn't look that bright. So we can keep grabbing it and continuously apply it. Or we can wait for that base layer to dry. Or we can make that pigment actually brighter to compensate for the darker pigment that's going to mix into it. As you can see, I'm opting for just applying more paint. As the paint dries in the base layer, this will become more and more prominent, as you can see. It's already happening. And you know what? Now I will get slightly more of a highlight, just for some added little pops of value and color. But here you can see that this building is now different from the ones we've previously done. This and this were similar in that they had all of these horizontal lines. This one works more with the vertical. Then for here, it's fairly similar. Except now we'll have a darker line separating it. So we'll get some Mars black, some cerulean blue, and I want there to be longer sets of windows that are vertical, so we'll create a separation with them here. We're looking for our perspective line. And you can see how this differs from our previous building. It too is blending with the lighter pigment, which is still a bit wet, making this less dark. It's not a bad thing though. Now I want to start creating some longer lines in between here, and because this is such a stretch, I am going to switch to a palette knife. You don't need to use one of this size or shape. You can grab a larger one and get the same effect, but we're essentially I'm going to take some of this cerulean blue, mix to that gray pigment. So we'll grab more of the same pigments that we used before. Start chopping that up. Here we have a really nice dark pigment, but we do need it to be a bit more blue and bright. And that's essentially what we want. But I'm going to keep working it for a minute, that way it's much more consistent. The more we go over it like this, the more the colors blend. And now I'm going to take off a lot of that excess, grab just a bit, find my edge, and incorporate some lines there. Now when you work with the palette knife, you essentially accept that things aren't going to be perfect. But again, in a piece where you're not aiming for realism, that isn't a bad thing, and it can actually give it a lot of character. So I like that a lot. We'll create some over here in this building. You can see that it skips some areas, which can be a nice look. And then if you want to make any of it more cohesive, you can switch to the brush and connect some parts. That way it's a combination of a very natural look with something that is a bit more painterly. And I think that combination, again, is what I really am looking for in this painting here. Now I do want a couple of longer windows in here, so we'll aim for something that is a bit brighter than this. So move it over, take some titanium white, hint of blue. Say, okay, you know what, the window is that big, let's give this a try right here. That's nice. We'll work that into some of these. It really brings out the shape. There we are. You can see that some of these are quite perfect while others aren't. Again, as long as you have the main base in there, you can be much more playful. There we are. Purposefully getting loose up here. And if you feel like you lose too much form, then you can go back to a darker pigment and just recreate some of those sharp lines with a lot of purpose. And we have a real combination of things happening here, which I like. So here's a bit of a wide shot so you can see how all of these buildings are starting to mesh together and how they are quite different from one another, despite the fact that we're using a very similar palette and a very similar set of lines. With that said, we're now going to head up into this area right here, and it's really interesting because this has been very detailed focus, and we're now going to give the eye a break and a little place to relax. And that's important in cityscapes because the eye, naturally it goes to the brightest, most heavy contrasted area of the painting, but it also goes to the most detailed area. And if the entirety of the painting is incredibly detailed, then you quickly end up with something that's just overwhelming and the eye doesn't know what to do. So we have simplified areas like this, and what we'll do in here, that'll just make it significantly more digestible. So let's head up in there and continue painting. But actually before we do, I would like to note that we are going to work some orange and yellow lights into this, just not yet. So recognize we're going to go back, we're going to add to it, and we're going to diversify, but I want to be a bit farther in the painting before we jump into that. So we're going to continue moving forward here in the painting. I'm now going to work on this, and I actually wanted to have a value that's a little bit darker than this, but lighter than that. So I have this really nice mixture that we were working with I think I'll test it and just see where it stands between these two. So I'll just work with some vertical strokes, that way it fits with the rest of the painting. And it's quite close to what I want, but it should be slightly brighter. So I'll take some titanium white, work that in, and you know what, that's actually it. Good. I always talk about how using the reference photo is so useful for color matching, but you can also color match with previous colors you made on your painting by looking at the reference photo and saying, okay, this is brighter than that, but it's darker than that. This is more saturated than that, but it's less so than that. And doing that is just an easy, intuitive way of going about it without having to print that out. There we are. So, I'm actually not going to add any windows really into that. We might add a couple dark spots, but really not much. Now I'm going to add this line right here for our next building. That said, we still need to do the back. So, more Mars Black, work that into our mixture, make it darker than what we were working with, and here we go. We've done this a lot because it's essentially blocking in a base, except this time we're not going to build much on it at all. I am occasionally working in horizontal strokes to fill in areas that are difficult to get to, but it's also just a good habit to get into. That way the entirety of the painting isn't made up of vertical strokes. Now I'm moving into this next building right here. It's going to share that same dark pigment, but I'm leaving a slight edge there where we worked that line of this brighter pigment. That way I can differentiate this building from this one. And that'll just make my life easier in a minute. Here you can see I'm, again, cutting in around the signs. We'll grab a combination of that lighter and darker color for this top spot and fill that in. Good. Now we'll keep using this brush. We'll make a highlighted version of what we have there. I'll start on my edge with some taps. Then I'll create another line of them in again. I'll move in, and you can tell it's incredibly subtle right now. I'm just figuring out where I want things to be. Again, if I want it to be more prominent, I can wait for it to dry or add another layer. But this is still visible to a point, so if I want to do that extra layer, at least I'll know where everything's going to be. I'll also add a diagonal line like this in there as well. And you know, we might add one right down here. Again, I'm just checking my horizon, making sure that's right. I think I'll come back to this, work on that. Now I'll switch my brush to the smaller flat-headed brush, build a brighter version, head to that edge, and then now that we're closer to the bottom here, I'll build up that highlight. Not trying to do much blending here. I want the sharp lines. I want the marks from the brush. That's what's going to give it a bit more of an impressionistic look a bit later when we're farther along. Seeing that pigment. And what some might consider imperfection, but others might consider a organic flow to the piece. There we go. I'm leaving the majority of the backing edge here a bit darker because of the shadows cast by the other buildings. And it's also going to break up the buildings as well. If you want, you can also create a darker mixture and work that back in between some of these if you'd like to sharpen them or make things smaller. Now, while we have that smaller brush, I'm going to take that dark pigment that we used up there, and I'm just going to fill in the areas in between this sign and this sign. In the reference photo, there is a Christmas tree, but I don't necessarily want to make this a holiday-themed cityscape, so I'm going to take that out, and I'm just going to paint what I'd imagine would be behind it. So here we have some connective pieces so that this sign can stay up and connected to the rest of the building. And there we are. It's a little detail, but again, we're continuing our common shape of the vertical rectangle. The sign itself, we'll start with a bit of a brighter blue because it'll be hypothetically lit up, and we'll want it to be a bit more gray as well, just in case we want to give it an orange glow later, which wouldn't work all too well with a blue. So, this is great. Again, if you want to make sure it's just right, you can test it on the reference photo, but I know I'm quite happy with this. Leaving the edges slightly brighter so that I can go over them with an even brighter pigment in a second. There. Now I'm switching back to that smaller brush, grabbing those highlights, mixing in more titanium white, and the initial idea here was just to create a brighter value along the edge, but I think we're also going to incorporate a darker value in between this and the rest of the sign. So we now have our sharp edges along the edge of the sign. Now I'll just grab a darker mixture that we used in somewhere up in those buildings, and then I'll come in and just give it a nice edge. You can see that I am doing a bit of a stroke here, but I'm also frequently lifting my brush, that way I can kind of reset and make it semi-straight. Grab more. If you want this to be perfect, just take more time, use green painter's tape, or redraw it on using the traceable. But again, I'm quite happy with the slightly more loose look that we have here. I'm also going to do a slight blend on the inside with it, keeping the outer stroke sharper. We are not doing too many soft blends in this painting, but I think this is one that can be quite advantageous in this area. So, while it may not look like we've actually done all that much in the last hour, it's important to recognize that this area in the distance has a lot of buildings, and that means continuously doing different things, taking time to figure it out, and changing all of our values. But when we get closer here in the foreground, we only really have the front of this building here, and then we have a big building right here. So things are going to get a bit more easy for us to distinguish and apply. This will actually go significantly more quickly. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to get a lighter blue like that, and I'm going to start on this building here. So I'm taking titanium white, our blue, Mars black, like that. I'll test this in our previous application. I'm actually not seeing a difference at all, which is exactly what we want. So now I'll start applying that on our edge, and I'll work in my base. As you can see, I already almost ran out of pigment, so I will go back to my palette here, grab more, work my way around this sign that we have right here, fill in these edges, and then the rest of it. Remember, if you don't feel like you have enough paint to fill this area adequately without stealing from other areas, mix more on your palette. I bring that up because I think I'm going to run out, or I'm going to be running extremely close to running out. We'll see. There we go. And do I have enough? Seemingly so. We got really lucky right there. So there's going to be a lot of detail down here in the bottom specifically, but a lot of that's going to be done with oranges and reds, and we're not quite there yet. So I'm going to head back up to the top, and I'm going to create some larger, darker spots. Taking some blue, some black, saying, okay, looking at my photo, I notice I come in about this much, and then there's this larger area, then there's a lighter spot in between, then we move down, lighter spot in between, down, then there seems to be a separation. Every time I do this, as you can see, the pigment runs out. It gets less and less dark and stark. Not a bad thing. We can go back to our palette, grab more pigment, or just let it naturally dissipate as you move down. Both of which are completely good options, depending upon how you want to do this. There we go. So this is significantly more simple, and I do want it that way. We'll create more of a highlight, like that, maybe a bit darker. Test this here, good. And then I'll create a separation between a couple of these. Work those colors out and around, that way it's cohesive, just in case the values are slightly different. And my brush stroke is somewhat loose, so that we get that painterly effect. But that's good for now. Again, the detail in that's going to come later with different colors. So now we move on to this building right here. And now that we're actually in the foreground, we're able to make something that's significantly darker. So I'm going to an area of the palette that isn't wet at all. That way we have a fresh start and I don't have to worry about lighter values mixing into this. Make the darkest pigment that we have thus far. It still has a bit of blue and white in it, but not that much. And then I'm going to go in to essentially the openings in this building, because all of these white areas that I don't have colored in are protruding. So we're going to the inset spots that just can't receive any light. And we're working this shadow in. This doesn't have to be perfect because we are going to be applying thick paint around all of these. But getting them relatively close will make it easier, because an almost black is a difficult color to work on top of because it's so stark. Acrylic paints are semi-transparent, and that's just something to consider. But we're progressively making these openings hypothetically bigger as we move closer to us, because perspective will make them look bigger. They aren't actually bigger, but that which is closest to us is perceived that way. So I'm just going to go ahead and work all of these in, and then I will see you in a minute for our next application. So now that I've worked in all of the darker, more inset areas in the building, we're going to work on the protruding edges. Sticking with the same larger brush, and I want to mix a blue that's quite similar to that. So I'll look at it, I'll say, you know what, it's quite blue heavy, but it's also quite dark, so blue and Mars black. So you know what, that's a little too dark and a little too saturated. So titanium white should change that quite well. And we'll give that a test. I can see that it's far too blue right now and a bit too bright. So I'll add more titanium white despite the fact that I need to darken it, because that titanium white is now going to mix with the Mars black that we throw in there and make it more gray, therefore less saturated. And now I'll try that. It's a little bit too dark, and you can see that I'm testing it on the building I want, and then I'm just kind of blending in those mixtures, and we can do that because, again, we're going for a more loose look to the painting. There we go, and that's what we actually want. So now I'm going to head back up here, and I am going to aim for fairly straight lines with this. I don't want the building to look like it's leaning, and I want something relatively clean to work off from. So while we were a bit more loose with our applications for the shadow inset areas, this is going to be much more fine-tuned, and I'm going to spend probably double the time working on it than I did those other pieces, consistently going back and fixing things. It's also an area where you could switch to the smaller flat-headed brush for really detailed areas. And I'm actually just going to work on all of it first, and then we'll go back in and we'll build additional highlights. So, as you can see, I filled in the rest of those strips there, and I left these little spots for lights, which will apply when we start working with our oranges and reds. But before we do that, I am going to come down here and just fill in the rest of the building and all of the areas that are essentially white with that same lightish blue that we were working with up here. I know that I am making a couple of additional cuts in the video right now. That's just because I do want this to be a video for you rather than 5 or 6 that we release over a month's time. Maybe in the future we'll really take some time and I'll show you each and every stroke. I think that would be really fun. It's something I do want to do, but I figured this would act as a good introduction to cityscapes. And I'll definitely get more quick at painting it and teaching it as we go. So, in the future we will do lessons that show a bit more of the process, but my goal here is to show you, in the very least, a bit of everything. That way you know the techniques, you know the mixes, and then you can go in and spend some additional time getting it just right for your painting. But I think at this point, if I were to include all of the footage, or rather all of the time spent painting, we may end up with a 12-hour painting lesson. Which again, maybe we'll do in the future, but not for the first one. So now that we have our building blocked in, we can head back in, do some extra detail work, and for that I'm going to build a brighter blue. So I'm looking to build something that's brighter than that, probably slightly more saturated. If anything, it should be similar to the highlight that we have back there. So I'll do a small mix over here first, just to give it a try, and if we like it, we'll mix more of it. So I'll test it. It's good. It's a little bit more gray, and it's a little bit darker than I wanted, so I'll add more titanium white and more blue, but not too much. Doesn't need a grand change at this point. And that actually looks great. So now I'm going to predominantly work to the left-hand side of the building and around the bottom of the building. And these are for the areas that are going to be catching a lot of light from the street and really sticking out. So, probably won't go any higher than that. I'll move on to this one. We'll let our strokes be a bit loose. We'll work in there. We'll build out that highlight. We'll build out the ones to the left here. Go back. And so this building right here, taking significantly less time than all of the buildings in the background, but taking up a similar amount of space. And that's because the detail is more repetitive and we know what we're doing. We're not pausing to do all of these different mixtures. We're not figuring out angles and how minute lighting changes affect things. We have a pretty good idea of how this is going to progress, and so we are making it progress in a much more timely fashion. You can see I'm going over things a couple of times here. Make sure you get rid of all of the white from the canvas with the exclusion of what we have there. Then I'll build it up yet again. More white and more blue. Then we'll go over the areas that we really want to pop. So we're doing a couple layers, being loose with it. I kind of have the highlights working in this triangular shape, but I'm not going for a smooth blend at the top. I'm just letting it naturally work the way it wants to. Now let's take just a minute and finish this sign that we have here. Now this one's straight on, it's looking directly at us, but this one's looking at the street. So the majority of what we see here is actually the side, and it's going to be quite dark. So I'll go to a darker mixture, grab some black, some blue, hint of white, head over to that right hand side of it, the area that's facing us, and we'll make that almost a black here. It's quite similar to what we have in between all of these protruding pieces, so it'll connect those two parts of the painting. These are relatively close to one another, so visually makes sense. The bottom of this might get some reflective light, so we'll throw that on in a little bit, but I like that for the beginning. Then we'll mix up a more grayish blue like that for this next part. Good. And then we'll fill these little spots in there with some darker pigment when we're done. Now we'll work on this final small little building over here on the right hand side, and that will actually complete the base values and colors for all of the buildings on the right side, which I think is a really big accomplishment. There's a lot of detail, there's a lot happening. Yes, we still need to go in and add the highlights and some really interesting strokes later on, but the majority of the work will be done. So for this building here, I want a value that's slightly darker than what we have. The pigment right there is right there, so I know, okay, you know what, we'll mix right beside. We'll make it darker than what it is right there, and you know what, that looks quite nice. So we'll come back up. I'll work on those edges. You can see it's quite close to what we have in the background. So you know what, we will brighten it up, just a hint. Make it more blue. See how this works. Even better. Now we do have some prominent windows in this building that I will be careful of working around. Bring that down to there. You can see just how efficiently a brush like this works around a delicate area if you rotate it correctly and work with patience. Definitely recommend going into this with a lot of patience, taking your time, and doing things right. Now I'll create some separation. Just like that. We'll get some of our darker pigment from before. Work that in. Create a little shadow here for this top part that can protrude. We'll do that on the base of the windows. And just like that, we have our final building. So let's take a step back and look at that half of the painting. So here we are, we've taken a couple steps back, and now we can look at all of that hard work we've done in context with all of the other pieces. It's cohesive, it fits together, and just look at all of that detail. What I think is really interesting about this piece is by the end, I think it will be by far the most detailed piece we've done here on the channel. However, I don't think it'll be the hardest piece because we're doing a lot of applications, we're creating a lot of sharp lines, we're creating a wide variety of values. However, we're not playing with a wide variety of colors, so our mixes are significantly more simple, and our applications, it's not this collection of very smooth blends. We do have much more rough marks happening in these buildings. And because of that, I think it's a much more accessible thing to paint than a lot of people will think it is. I do think that if you take your time with this, that you make sure that your perspective, that your drawing, if that's all correct, and your values and your pigments are relatively correct, you're going to come out with a really, really beautiful piece. And again, it's so neat because it will probably be the most visually complicated and seemingly difficult piece on the channel, but it won't be. It's a really neat thing. And I like that a lot because I feel like it's one of those things where if you are a beginner or someone who is just learning to paint, this is something that's doable if you just take your time and you go step by step, making sure each building's the way it should be. Again, making sure perspective and line work, it's all good. You can end up with a really great piece. With that said, we are going to jump back into this and continue making this the best painting we can. We are going to need to add a lot of color. It's looking a little gloomy, which makes sense because it is a rainy day, but I really do want to brighten it up and give it a bit of a dreamy effect. So let's hop back into it and have some fun. So next we're heading over to the left-hand side of the painting. I'm back to the 1-inch flat-headed brush, and we're going to work right here. Now, my brush is damp, so I do get a bit of a reaction like that initially, and we're going to mix a pigment similar to what we have right there in that building. So I start with some blue, some white. Looks like we'll get quite a bit of pigment here, which is nice. Should do essentially what we need, and then I'll slowly add in Mars Black until we get what we want. I'll test this over here. I can see that it's significantly brighter than what we want, so I'll just do a little blend with that. You can see that that is getting a bit of a dreamy effect. It's almost like rain's hitting it, and then it's reflecting, kind of coming off. So I do like that. The painting slowly changes as we do test colors. Test another one. And that looks significantly more correct. That said, it could use a hint more blue, so we'll add that, and then we'll head up into this area. We'll start with our base layer. You can see that my pigment is quite thick. We did mix a lot, and that makes this really easy. That said, generally I advise mixing a lesser amount of pigment initially, testing it, and then once you know you have what you want, mix a lot. Occasionally you can get away with this. I myself was lucky. And there we go. And I'll actually just continue working this down around our signs. I'm actually just going to continue this pigment fairly far down. I'm looking for where these would be attached, and I'll leave an opening for that. And then down here we essentially get to people and umbrellas and things. So, see that there's an umbrella essentially right where my brush is, so I'll leave that arch there. I'm being fairly loose right now. And then we'll continue this set of buildings out into the back. There. Then we'll fix all of this up. Some vertical strokes. And we'll head back up into the top. Now I'm going to wait for that to dry, and while I do, I'm going to mix up a darker bluish black with just a hint of titanium white. I essentially want this to be a cool looking silhouette. And I'll start working on this right here. We're going to have a lot of these in the painting, and they are going to add so much detail to the piece in a little bit. We're going to add different values, colors to them. But for now, we're just putting in that base layer. It's important to recognize that these are going to be the most thick where they connect to the main pole here, and that they taper as they get towards the light. There we go. I'm also going to take this and we're going to fill in our sign, which will add detail to probably in another hour or so. I want to do a lot of the detail and lighting at once. That way I can balance each part of the painting and I make sure I don't do too much in any one area. So as you can see, I filled in the bottom of the sign. We're still waiting for that to dry. And when I step back, I actually realize that I want the backing area here to be just a bit brighter. I want this to be a brighter value than what I have here and here. And at this point, it's fairly equal. So we're going to move back. I'm going to take some titanium white, a little bit of blue, a little bit of black. And this time I'm going to start brighter than I think I need to. And if we need to, we can make it darker. So I'm going to go over all of those little buildings that I applied last time, and as you can see, we definitely have something that's a bit brighter, a bit more blue, and I might actually make it brighter than it currently is, but we'll start with this. Now generally we work background to foreground so that we don't accidentally layer portions of our background over our foreground. However, in a rainy scene with a light like this, it's reflecting everywhere, that isn't a bad thing. It will give it more of a dreamy quality, especially because it'll give it a look of almost diffused light working its way over portions of the foreground. So here I'm going back and brightening, and I just cut right in front of this building a little bit. It's semi-transparent, so you can still see the edge of the building, but it softened things. And that's not a bad thing. I'm actually trying to do it a couple places right now. We have some right there. You can see some actual tooth of the canvas right there. I like that. Could be a little more subtle maybe, but as a whole, I like the idea of it. Makes it more loose. There we are. I'll even go over the pole right now, that way we get a consistent transition from this to that. And I can go back over this if I want to, but I actually like the little pitter-patter of highlight on it. Kind of looks like rain hitting it. There we are. So, doing a good job of brightening that up. Making the transition a bit wider. Before we only had that light down at the bottom, now I'm expanding. We'll throw some right in between here. Fill that area out. Have some of that light work its way on top of the almost black here and there. That way again you get that diffused look. It looks like the light's coming out and through that area. When you have almost no paint, you can just work it over buildings in the back. It's a little risky though, so make sure you don't have much paint. With that said, that turned out great. Here I'm just letting this building get lost in the distance even more. And it's not this atmospheric in the reference photo, but it's okay to take artistic liberties and, make it your own. So I like that a lot. I think the top area has dried enough, and now that means we can go back in and add little windows. So I'm going to take this brush, I'm going to mix up a darker blue, very dark, like that. And I'm actually going to grab a different palette knife. This came in the set that I ordered. Again, I'll leave a link to it in the description, but as you can see, it has some teeth. And this is really neat because you can just grab pigment and then apply 5 or 6 very similar windows with it. Don't have to do this. You could use the smaller flat-headed brush, but I just thought it was such a neat technique. Gives it a different look than anything else in the painting. Maybe you'd want to try it. Again, you don't have to. The brush will work, but should you want to be a bit more exploratory, this is an option. There we go. Now I will switch back to the brush, grab more of that pigment, create a larger window right here, another one right there. I think we'll darken a couple of these. Just give them additional pigment where they're a little soft. Not doing it to all of them, just some. That way, again, it looks like there are different lighting situations in each, and it brings more life to the city. So far, so good. And again, I'm doing some of this from an afar like I am right here, just because I think it's really useful to see it in context with the rest of the painting. So you know, okay, this building, it's relatively this far away, so these darks are essentially as dark as these. They're not quite as dark as these because it's not that close. You don't see that contrast. There is all of this rain, mist, all of it kind of in the way, stopping those dark darks from being so stark. There we go. And then there are also some seemingly dark ledges in here as well. Just checking the reference photo. Making small abbreviations here and there, but for the most part following along. I think we'll also create a bit of a highlight. Blue, white, black. For some protruding areas. So now we're finally going to head down into the sidewalk and the street here, and we're going to finish off the predominantly blue areas in the painting. After this, we will have to start working with some additional colors, but hopefully now that we're, a couple hours in, you're feeling fairly warmed up. With that said, we are going to start by just creating a very, very dark pigment. It's going to be almost black. It's going to have a hint of blue and white in it, but we're going to map in just a couple of things we don't want to lose. Some of the starker subjects that we have in the foreground. And I'll paint on top of this with other colors and thin layers, but the idea is that a little bit of it will show through in the end. So I'm just working in all of these. My brush is fairly damp, which is allowing me to create these fairly sharp marks. As we get into the distance, these are going to get smaller and closer together because perspective will just make them look that way. Then when we get closer, we'll apply more pressure with our brush. It'll expand our bristles and we'll get a much more prominent, large application. See that? I'm going to grab a bit more water here. And we'll just create another one of these. Now the majority of this here is also going to be quite dark. It's essentially just a myriad of these vertical beams and bars like this. However, they're all so close together that you don't really see any of the detail because they're overlapping each other. So here in the distance especially, we can just paint that in. I'm going to leave a slight opening there in between some of these gate-like fences. And I'll do the same right there as well. But this is essentially a fairly easy process and way to jump into the bottom of our painting. So as you can see, I finished filling that in, and now we're going to take more of that same really dark pigment and we're going to just paint in some of the openings here in the grate. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're going to have to come back with paint and put it in between all of these, so if we need to clean it up, we can do that. But we're just essentially getting all of the line work in here. That way, when we go into the next layer, we don't lose it and have to re-sketch it, figure out the perspective, or use a traceable again. Again, you can see just how loose all of this is. That's okay. We'll also take a bit more of that pigment and we'll work it onto these right here. So I'm using this brush because again it has that nice sharp edge, and with a little bit of a turn you can create a really nice smooth look to these. That said, we do have to paint around them, so again, don't worry too much about it being perfect. Now we're going to mix up a fairly light blue using quite a bit of cerulean blue, quite a bit of titanium white, and then finally a very small amount of Mars black. And this is going to be for the reflection of the light up top that's streaming down here. Now I'm going to start with this as close to the street as I can get. So I'm working along this line right here. And then we'll have it dissipate as it gets closer to us because we're moving farther away from that light. And I'll also have it dissipate as you move closer to this side here where we're going to get a lot of people, a lot of shadows, and it'll just start to dissipate. So I started with that initial line across the edge, working out to here, and then I'm going to say, you know what, I think that right there is quite good. Now let's make this a bit darker. Extra blue, extra black. Make that nice and easy. It's not all that much darker, so we'll do more blue. Where was I mixing? I've completely lost it. Right here. The trouble with a pure blue palette. Okay, so that's darker. So that's a good step in the right direction there. And here you can see I'm just working my way more to the left. I'm essentially following the edges of what we have here. And I'll also now work my way right across these side pieces. Now you can leave this choppy, you can go for a smooth blend. I'm going to go for a lot of brush strokes, really. And then I'll make it even darker yet again. Just like that. We'll work our way along the edges we know we need to keep clean first. And then I'll work my way to the right. Now in the reference photo, these are a bit more stark in difference. And we can go back and make them more stark, but I wanted to start with something a bit brighter because it's a lot easier to make things darker than it is to make them brighter. I'll also just incorporate a hint of that over here. Not much though. Going to have people and a lot of other things happening in that area. So, off to a good start. Now we can make it darker. If you stick predominantly with these horizontal strokes and you do a lot of this wet into wet, it will look like wet reflections, which is a pretty nice look. And it'll make a lot more sense in just a minute. But with that, while I have this fairly dark mixture, I'm going to go right in between all of these. I'm just going to slowly build that up. These are going to cast a shadow, but we are going to have light showing through underneath these, which is right here, and then you'll also get a bit more light over on this side. So we're just going to the middle with this darker pigment, and because we did the almost black earlier, I can still see the majority of these through it, which is great. That's why we did that. Now I'll mix to a brighter pigment yet again. So I'll throw in some extra blue, hint of white. Look at my reference photo, say, okay, you know what, it's on this side. Work my way over. So again, you don't have to have the perfect blend. You just want to show that there's a difference in color and value. Then I'm going over to this side and I'm doing the same. You can see that I am working over the previously established applications. I'm okay with that. A lot of effects are reflections, so I am being a bit more loose with them, admittedly. It's not a bad thing. Come back in, reintegrate some of that darker shadow. We're really in the foreground now, so this is where it's going to be extremely prominent, where you'll really notice it. And again, predominantly horizontal strokes for that reflective look. And I'm slowly just taking more black, working that into the middle, more so at the front, and then letting it dissipate as we move back. Just like that. Now we'll make significantly more of that really dark mixture. And we'll just repaint these in. I can still kind of see them through what we just did. And I'll probably go back and paint these a couple times because right now it's mixing with all of the blue. It's giving it a nice cohesive look, but I do want it to be stark in some areas, so we'll come back to this a little bit later as well. Lots of layering in this one. Now I'm building this back up. There we go. From there we'll take more of the dark blue that we have right around there, and we'll fill in these. Now this is something that is going to take significantly more time. Try to make this look fairly clean. And when we're done this, we'll start painting again together. But as you can see, we're just trying to fill in all of those white spots and some of the areas that we may have covered up with the almost black earlier on. Keep your brush nice and wet. Don't apply much pressure for those smaller marks. And you can switch to the 1/4 inch flat-headed brush for real detail should you feel like you need it. I probably will. So I've been fixing up this area here for the last hour or so, and I want to show you a couple of the different techniques that I'm finding really useful. With that said, we will be doing a lot of this in real time over to the right hand side. I just wanted to make sure I had a good grasp of how I wanted to teach this technique, and now that I know, I think we can accomplish some great things with some extra detail here. So first of all, I am taking my palette knife, though yet again you don't need it. You can use that smaller flat-headed brush. I'm going to create some very dark pigment here. Get the side of the palette knife full of it. Then I'm going to come across and create some separation in our sidewalk here. So if you apply a very minimal amount of pressure, you can get a significantly more thin line. You can also drag it. But I like to keep a couple of openings. I think it keeps it really interesting, shows that the sidewalk isn't laid absolutely perfectly, that there are changes to it over time, and that it's a bit more natural looking. Now I'm also taking this and I applied it right under this, and then I kind of just dragged down, and it gave it a really nice shadow effect here. I also really heightened the shadows here and here, and you can see that in contrast with what we have under that. As you can see, I also sharpened that with the smaller flat-headed brush. With that said, another thing I started to do in here, you can see all of these little taps, right? Looks like water on rock. For that, we'll take some titanium white, some of our blue, hint of our Mars black. See that? Nice highlight. And then I'll come in and I'll just do all of these little taps. So I waited to do the real highlights. And occasionally we'll overlap. Again, we're going to the brightest area, working out from there. Going quite well. But then eventually, as we start to move out to that side, we're going to switch to something a bit darker. So then I add extra blue, I add extra black, and then here we have some more gray. And in this process, I think a lot of people are kind of initially worried about mixing more grays, but they make every other color pop. Anything next to them really stands out, and so it can be a really fantastic accent pigment to work with. Here I'm taking some of that almost black that we had over there, I'm moving it, and the more we do of this, the more things start to work into each other, and it looks like a nice water. We will create maybe another lighter blend, go in between the highlights and these darker gray areas. And if you keep this relatively wet and semi-transparent, you'll build a really neat effect where you see other colors underneath as well as different patterns and applications. So again, I probably spent about an hour doing this before. Definitely a time-consuming way of applying it, but I think one that renders really beautiful results. So once I had that initial gradient in place, started to move on top of all of it with this. We used the gradient as our base layer, and we used this to establish our detail and all of that. It's also worth noting that I am going over previously applied applications, colors, and pigments. If we get slight blends here and there, I'm actually quite happy about that. Not something to shy away from. Here's much more of a blue heavy mixture. So if you find you accidentally work in too much gray or too much almost white, you can always retreat back to this, work over some of those areas, and you can see that I'm being quite playful with this as well. Like that area a lot. I didn't do any of it in here though, so here you can watch that move over these darker areas and just how beautiful that looks. We will be coming back and adding highlights to these bars here, but not quite yet. And as we get farther and farther away, this really dissipates because they essentially get so small, all of these reflections and markings, that they visually amalgamate and you just don't recognize them in the same way you do as something up here. You can see that I'm also occasionally going all the way across the shadow. Sometimes there's a lucky little bit of reflective light that finds its way. It can be a beautiful application. Now we're moving back up in the painting, and we're going to tackle this area right here, which is quite interesting because it's actually just an amalgamation of people kind of packed into a single area. And it's really dark, so you can't see a lot of difference in detail or color, and so it kind of becomes an odd shape. And we'll give slight highlights in the end to establish individual forms. Perhaps someone has a reflective coat that will really build on. But right now I just want an incredibly dark bluish base layer. And here I'll start with the top of an umbrella I see in the reference photo. It's also worth noting that a person at this point is about yay tall at this area in perspective. If you look over at a car, it's a size that makes sense. So here I'll just paint the umbrella so you can see, again, reference for size. There's another one, there's another one. And now essentially, we can just fill this area in. Go back to my palette, grab more paint. We don't want to thin it out too much. You can tell right there that it is quite thin, and that's because I used quite a bit of water on my brush so I could get that sharp line for the umbrella. But that does mean we need a good amount of pigment to go over that area successfully. So I'll grab /mix more, come down to here, and as we get closer to us we could establish a leg, something noteworthy that a person would have. So you know what, let's do that. Let's just do a leg like this. I believe there's an elbow, there's a shoulder and an elbow in the reference photo. Maybe that's what we'll make this. So we'll have an opening right there. So here's the arm, and it gets lost in this cluster. Here's an opening between the arm and the body, and we're just looking for subtlety like that. Remember, this is going to be an impressionistic piece, and so keeping things loose like that really isn't a bad thing. There I added another possible person, and then we'll just fill in the bottom here. Do another umbrella, kind of protruding in front, so it's smaller. And just like that, we have a cluster of people, which we can now take our smaller 1/4" brush, mix up some lighter pigment. Recognize that it'll be significantly darker when we apply it here because we are mixing on top of a wet, very dark pigment. So I'm going to compensate by making it slightly brighter. Then I'll find areas that I think will catch light, like the top of this umbrella, and I'll incorporate those. Like that. Say, okay, you know, this is a person right here. We can add some highlight to that. We can add some highlight to the edge of this coat. Just blend that back in, nice and soft. So, as we take a couple of steps back, it becomes significantly more noticeable what we're painting in that cluster. It's one of those things where you just kind of have to trust the process. With that, I think we'll heighten a couple of the highlights in there. So I'll just mix up a slightly brighter bluish gray than what we had before. I'll come back to some of the areas that, again, I feel really deserve a highlight. Generally, it'll be the tops of umbrellas, and you can work them really in here in a lot of different ways. And you know, maybe we'll have a bit more of a highlight on a person or two. Here's an elbow, just like that. We can heighten this one, predominantly at the top and the shoulder. I think that's interesting. Might do a bit of a blend. Make it look a little wet, just like that. Applying it to the top, doing a drag with my finger. And then I re-establish the form in it. Something else we can do, now that we have individuals in our painting, we can take some of our Mars black, hint of our titanium white, a little bit of blue. We can go down to the bottom of them, and we can create shadows, like that. And we can just work this really as far as we'd like. I would recommend looking at the reference photo every now and then just to make sure you're still on track. or just follow along. But again, these are the times where everything starts to kind of come together, where we do get into all of the shadows and the subtle highlights. You can also soften some of these if you'd like with these mixes. Will blend with those nice highlights we have there. Grab more of that highlight. I'm just trying to make it look like a real group of people. That said, you're not always going to have an umbrella, so maybe this time we'll paint a hood. Leave it fairly nebulous though. Accentuate the edges of some people here. Just openings in clothing. Little things like that. You can also throw in some extra highlights in here, in between the shadows, just to accentuate the shadows. So you have a shadow there, so I threw highlights right in the middle. Now right here's a really interesting area because we actually have a building in front of the one that we have here, but behind this. So for that, I'm going to mix up a slightly brighter value than what I have there. So I'll start with titanium white, a little bit of blue, small amount of Mars black. We'll keep it fairly bright until we know how it works in contrast with this. So just start like that. Say, okay, you know what, that looks good. And then I'll continue it down here. We're going to make some really large windows. And this essentially works all the way down to the people who cut off the view from the bottom of it. And then here we'll have the front of the store, which is merely a reflection at this point. Good. Now we'll take more of our highlight and we'll start separating these into some rectangles. Like so. There we are. Now I do want to differentiate this value from the one we have there, so I'll get some additional Mars black, blue, white, and I'll just try to make it slightly darker than what we had there, and also a bit more of a saturated blue because we are moving closer into the foreground, and generally in the foreground things are a bit more saturated. So here you can see my brush fits pretty perfectly, and I'm just trying out that initial mixture. So you know what, I like it, but it could be darker, could be more blue. So that's why we generally mix less paint initially. I'm going to let this be a bit more loose looking. We have a lot of very strict form down here. And remember, in the end, I do want this to be more impressionistic. So we'll start by making these windows. Not perfect blends. There we are. You know what? I think I'll do slight movement there. Give it a bit more of a dreamy look. Make a similar highlight to what we initially had for it on the edges. So we've been doing a lot of detail work, and I thought it was about time that we took some steps back, looked at our painting, and kind of reviewed it as a whole, because it's so easy to really dial into a specific area, make sure it has enough detail, make that area perfect, but then forget how it works in the context with the rest of the painting. So by taking these steps back, we get to look at it as a whole. And there are a couple things that we're trying to work towards on a grander scale here. The first is a bit of a vignette effect. And that's essentially when the edges are a bit darker, because the eye innately goes to the brightest point of any piece or picture, and by making the edges darker, you ensure that when the viewer looks at your painting, they go to the middle of it, and there's a higher chance that they stay in it for a longer period of time. So, what we're doing to accomplish that is we've made this corner really dark. We have almost blacks there in this, in the people, in that right there, and we have a lot of leading lines moving up towards this brighter spot, which is the brightest spot in this whole area, right? We are going to add some lamps, some lights, some reflections that are going to be brighter, but they're also essentially going to be in that middle area. Something else we've done is we made that really quite dark, as well as some of the windows up there, and in that corner, the inset spots, they are the darkest, kind of almost black on this set of buildings. So look at your painting, make sure that those, and this really are the darkest darks, and that this area right here is essentially the lightest light. If it isn't that way at this point, don't worry about it. You can always go back over it with darker or lighter pigments. And again, in a rainy scene, completely okay to go back over the background in the sky, because if you do accidentally get a bit of that pigment on your buildings or foreground, it actually looks quite good as diffused light. So that's something we're working towards. Another thing I'd quickly like to note is that this area right here, it's more heavily saturated, because the closer you are to something, especially on a rainy day, the more of the innate natural saturated colors you're going to see, and the farther things get, the more of a gray they adopt, because there's so much of this light bouncing around. And it's just important to recognize that what we're doing next is going to be more saturated. It's going to have more of a contrast, and that's accentuated by the rainy day. So with that said, let's jump into it, get a little bit closer, and start working on that area right there. I'm getting quite excited to start working on the lights. So now we're quite close to moving into the road, but before we do that, I want to finish up this pole right here, that stop sign, and how it kind of works down into the bottom. So we're just going to grab some Mars black, a little bit of blue, a little bit of titanium white, not too much. Then I'll use this 1-inch flat-headed brush to create a pretty easy rotated square here. Try to make sure that it's fairly even on all sides. If you find it quite difficult, remember, just use the traceable or find something small and square and trace around it. There we go. I'm using quite a bit of water. That way I get extremely sharp edges. It does mean I'll have to go over it again, but I'm okay with that. Better to take the extra time and get it right. Now, I'll grab some extra pigment. I will follow the main line that I have from my light. We'll have it come down in front of these people, and then it'll have a large base right down here. And this too will just kind of get lost in that mass. And that looks quite good. There we are. Now, of course, the edges are going to be reflective to a point, so I'll grab some extra titanium white, some extra blue, more white. I'll head to the edge, and I'll just work this down. It expands here, then yet again it expands at the bottom. The other side will get a little bit of light, but not as much, because the light's coming from there. There we go. You can make that a higher contrast if you'd like, but for now I think I'm going to keep it quite subtle. We are going to add some color into that and our other sign as well, just not quite yet. Now we're moving down into the street, and this is where things get really fun, because now we get to start playing with other colors like our cadmium red and our primary yellow. So I'm going to start in the background here with a familiar pigment, some blue, some white, a little bit of black, and right now I'm essentially just trying to remix something similar to the highlight that we have in there. So I can try it. I can tell that it's slightly more blue than we want, so I need to desaturate it. We do that by taking more white and more black. We'll use a similar ratio of white and black to our initial one. That way it doesn't get too dark, it just gets less blue. And that works great. So now I'll come to this gate that we have up here. I'll work my way around these to begin with. Monitoring my reference photo, making sure I'm not going too far. If you go over the black pigment, it's quite easy to kind of work backwards and just scrape it off. But this essentially goes down to here. And then we work it out to the side. It essentially surrounds this manhole. And we'll work it out to there. Good. Right, now we are going to take a bit of our cadmium red, work that in there. This will start to give us a bit more of a purple look. I'll head in here, and I'll start moving that out. Get some more red, more blue, just heighten it a slight bit. You can always test it on the reference photo, make sure it's just right. Needs to be dark, but not as dark as this. And this is going to be a combination of colors, the blue from the atmosphere and all of the reds from the lights in the cars. Now I am starting with a dark base layer, which we will work on top of fairly soon. And I'll also blend it into our blue a little bit here, so that things start to feel more cohesive. Using that sharp edge to cut around the manhole yet again. And we'll extend that to right about there. Now, it's time to make it even darker. So, more black, we'll saturate it more, red, blue, red. Make it a bit more blue, heavy than that, and that's it. So I'm going to start blending this into our previous application via a series of these horizontal strokes. And I'm actually just using the corner of the brush, if not half the side. And I'm blending one into the other through these taps. I'm not looking for a perfect gradient. I'm looking for little bits of each color to work their way into the other. And we'll really accentuate this technique in a minute. Now I believe there's a line right there, so I'll just draw that out. Now I know not to go over it. We'll get some more red, blue, black. So every time we do this, we're working with less and less white. And we're making it darker and darker the farther we get away from that light. And eventually this other corner will have quite the vignette effect, just like all of the others. You can see just how close this value is to that of the almost black gate at this point. And again, I'm just going back and forth with this little tap effect. There we go. Also, I know that we don't have much detail down here. That's okay, we will be adding it in a minute. Working in horizontal strokes and the occasional tap, that way I just see that texture and movement in there. So, from there it's time to build some highlights. Going to grab the 1-inch flat-headed brush. And you see the technique we have there that I talked about before and we did a brief demonstration of. Now we're going to do a significantly more elaborate demonstration. So I'll start by grabbing some red, some blue, we'll mix those together. They'll give us a fairly dark reddish purple. Grab some titanium white. Build a brighter version of it. And that's really pretty. It's subtle, but it's pretty. And now I'm going to take this right in that transition area between these darker purples and this blue. And I'm going to start working this up here, making my strokes up here incredibly small because they are farther away. And then they get larger as we move into this area. Now the cerulean blue and cadmium red aren't going to render a very bright or prominent purple. And that's not a bad thing. Sometimes you want it to be more subtle. Though you can use a different red or blue if you want this to be more stark. I personally really like what we're accomplishing now. With all of these taps, just bringing it together. Building a wet road. See how I let it dissipate? And then I'll pick specific areas to accentuate. Getting more water on my brush. Now we'll mix more of our bright blue and we'll bring that down into our purple area. So I'll test that up here. Do those horizontal strokes, that way we have that pattern pre-established. And then here we go. And it's lots of layers of this that are really going to make it special. Remember, I probably spent an hour on that area right here, so keep at it. Put layer on top of layer. Eventually you'll get what you want. There we go. Sometimes I pick up a bit of darker pigment and I work that right back up here. And just make sure that this doesn't look flat. You're going to want to work all the way over to the right-hand side eventually, with the most subtle of brighter values. That way the entirety of this has that same technique and movement. I'm probably going to spend another half an hour to 45 minutes working on this. And then I think we'll jump back into it together. So I probably continued working on that there for another 10 minutes, and I decided to hold off on the massive amount of highlight and detail because I really want to do this first and see just how much I can afford down here, because again, this is where we want the eye, and if we make that too complicated, then we move it somewhere we don't want it to be. So I'm going to take that 1-inch flat-headed brush. I'm going to make a bit of a darker blue, like that. And I'm going to incorporate that right here and right here. Areas where I don't feel like there's going to be a lot of light streaking down, that are quite close to the cars. So I see a light there, say, okay, there's going to be light streaming there. I see a light there, so we'll avoid that spot as well. There's quite a bit of light in the middle. Then that has some. So we're just dodging light. And eventually we work our way back down into our previously applied areas. So right now we're essentially sketching with paint, just figuring out where everything's going to be. This is going to be both a mix of very dark and very light, so I'll skip that for right now, and I'll head back over into this area. You can also interject a hint of red over in that spot. So we'll do just that. Again, working our way in between the light. And you can be a bit more loose with it. When you do these horizontal strokes, as you can see, it kind of looks like there's a shimmering effect happening there. And that can be quite nice. And eventually, of course, it dissipates and ends. Now this is something we'll have to come back to and add additional detail like that. But yet again, we are currently implementing a base layer. We also need to watch out for this line right there. Work that nice under the car, trying to keep it very sharp right now. Using the corner of my brush here and there. Give that wheel a nice rounded effect. Build some of the pigment that's a little thin. So while we've mapped in a couple of good areas for reflections, as you can see, the rest of this now looks a little bit messy next to this area that we've really fine-tuned with the smaller flat-headed brush. So we're going to head back into there. I'm going to create some of those mid-dark blues and purples, and we'll start working them into these areas. That way we have a fairly cohesive application down here in the street, and everything fits together beautifully. Again, this is something where you probably want to put quite some time into, so don't rush it. Continuously go back, tweak your mixes, make them better, and have fun with it. I think at this point it's getting a little late, so I'm going to finish this up, just this bottom area, going over all of this again with this stroke where I'm kind of just going back and forth, connecting a couple areas, leaving others not connected. I'll make some dinner, and then tomorrow we'll pick back up again. So here we have a wide shot. It is the next day, everything is completely dry, and at this point I am really happy with how this painting is turning out. We're moving into a very exciting part of the painting. We're going to start incorporating some oranges and a lot of colors that are really going to stand out nicely against the blue. We're going to be working with complementary colors, And with that, before we jump into it, I would like to take a minute to say a big thank you, as I try to do in all of these videos, to our patrons up over on Patreon. It is because of you that I'm able to make these paintings over multiple days, that we're able to work on these larger canvases and really put a lot of time into this. So thank you for making these lessons happen each and every week. If it wasn't for you, simply wouldn't be able to do it. As a lot of you know, this channel is primarily fan funded, and I can't thank you enough for, providing me the opportunity to teach these lessons each and every week, and for being able to create paintings like this. I know there aren't a lot of cityscapes and things of this nature on YouTube because they do take significantly more time, and they are a bit of a initially optically more tricky subject, but I think together we can really craft some beautiful work here. With that said, again, big thank you. If you are new to the channel and you'd also like to help support the channel, you can do so up over on Patreon. Up there we have all of the traceables, reference photos, a back catalog of a bunch of exclusive lessons. I have 5 different ebooks, some of which full with traceables, others are simply on the basics, one of which is Acrylics for Beginners. It's essentially everything you need to know before you jump into your first acrylic painting. We talk about composition, color matching, when to use water, what brushes to use, all of that good stuff. And I also do fun things like personalized critiques, and we have a private Facebook group where we all kind of share our work and help each other with that sort of thing. So if you're interested in any of that, go and check it out. But with that, on the note of the traceable, I'm actually going to zoom in on that reference photo, that traceable, and replot in where all of my lights and lampposts are going to be. So I'm going to do that. You can follow along on the traceable, or you can just wait for me to finish, then we'll paint them all in together. With that said, let's jump back into it and have some fun. So I've sketched in all of the additional posts, and now I'm going to take that 1/4 inch flat-headed brush, make sure it's nice and damp, grab some fresh Mars Black, hint of Cerulean Blue, hint of Titanium White, mix those together, and we'll just start painting these on. Now, when we are closer to us, as we are here in the foreground, we're going to make this darker and more stark. So you can see that the value of this is actually quite similar to that of our post right here. They kind of get lost together, which is a nice thing. But as we start to move back, much like the buildings, we want them to inherit significantly more blue and gray. So now I'm going to take a hint more Titanium White, work that in, hint more Cerulean Blue, like that. And now we can work on that next one. And the farther away we get, the less pressure we want to use with our brush. We want these to be nice and delicate, nice and small in the background here, and we'll do a couple with this mixture. And then, yet again, we'll play with it and make it slightly brighter. I do think, however, we should probably get slightly more Mars Black and thicken this one. Generally like to make these subjects smaller initially, and then if we need to, I expand them, but it's a lot easier to make them larger than it is to make them smaller again. So there we go. Now we'll get more Titanium White, more blue, just like that. Move a bit farther into the distance, and that is a nice subtle transition from the last. You can see that they're kind of getting lost behind these 2 poles. There we go. Now, as you start to run out of paint with this, your application will become more transparent, which is great because it looks more subtle in the background, but you have to be careful because as you lose that pigment in that water on the brush, generally the stroke gets larger, and we don't really want that. There we go. Now we'll get some extra Mars Black, Titanium White, Cerulean Blue, and we'll work on posts on this side. I am trying to be much more mindful of my hand placement now. There we go. Grab a bit more. There will be a couple in the distance here we can play with. So as you can see, on top of the regular lights, I actually added this extension on these two, and they have this little piece that protrudes out this way. I didn't see it on the initial reference photo I was using because I actually have a simplified reference photo, which I'll also include up over on Patreon, but I used that for the majority of this because the city is just so complicated. There's so many details in it, and I simplified it in Photoshop so it was a bit more digestible. However, little pieces were lost, so I am occasionally going back to the original reference photo, and that is where I saw these. So I just threw them in quickly, thought I'd show you where they are, and with that, we'll just jump right back into it. Now, while we wait for those street lights to dry, we're going to start working in the reflections here. And this is really exciting because these are going to pop so beautifully against all of the colors we've previously incorporated. Now, for this, I would highly recommend working with clean water and a clean brush because you don't want to dilute these new brighter pigments with the darker mixes you were using. And for this, I'm going to use another flat-headed brush. This one is about 1/2 inch. So, I'm going to start now for the first time by mixing some of our cadmium red, a very small amount of our primary yellow. It's going to give it a hint of orange. Then we'll grab a small bit of white and about half that of black. Mix these together. As you can see, we end up initially with a fairly toned down red. And I'm going to start using this along the sides here, really in the middle of our reflections. And we'll build on top of this slowly, but on the sides I am switching back to this very small side and sharp application. Just like that. Mix up a little bit more. And I would recommend mixing small amounts, at least initially, because we haven't really played with this color palette yet, and you're going to want some practice before you start mixing really large quantities. So just start with this one right here. Filling in the middle, then working that pigment to the left and right, allowing it to dissipate. That way we get a semi-transparent edge, so it looks like that water and that reflection on the street is just getting lesser and lesser. And we can also throw it in here. Now I'm going to be fairly loose with a lot of this because, again, I do want this piece to have hints of impressionism. I don't want it to be hyper real. I want to accentuate the atmosphere more than anything. So I'll be a little bit loose here initially. Then yet again we work to the left and to the right, trying to make sure that I jump around. That way the protruding pieces aren't always the same length, size, or kind of occurring on both the left and right hand side. I'm trying to be quite playful with it and randomize the process. Once we have a couple of those worked in though, we are going to brighten our mixture a bit. So extra red, extra yellow, and you want this to be a predominantly red mixture because if the yellow mixes with the black it will make a green. We don't want that. So here we have something a bit brighter. And we're just working towards more of an orange here. So you can see that I'm slowly adding more red and yellow, which are getting more and more saturated because we're overwhelming the blacks and whites in the pigment. Now I can start by applying that here in the middle. You can see that it is more saturated than that previous application. Gives it an added pop. And you do want to keep this predominantly in that center area. We can spread it out a little bit, as you can see, but I want to have a buildup of light in the center of these. So now I'm going to switch to a smaller brush, that being the 1/4 inch flat-headed brush. We'll take more yellow, we'll take significantly more white. This is going to desaturate it, but it's really going to brighten it. And that's what we want. So, now I find that light on the back of the car, and we go from that middle portion and just tap on some applications here. And it's important that we don't kind of bend it, even if we lose areas in which we can apply it. If there needs to be a little break, because here there just isn't as much light, we don't start moving it over there. And this is something we're going to want to build up over numerous layers. You can also start applying it over here. So I'm just putting some of that pigment down, then I'm working it to the left and right. There we go. Now this pigment here is getting quite thick, and if we were to apply more pigment to it, it would probably get lost in the mix. We'd start to get something a little muddy. So I'm going to let this dry, and then in about 2 or 3 minutes, we'll come back in and we'll incorporate even more highlight. But in that time, I'm just going to add the darker base layer to the rest of these. So while I was in the process of filling these in, I actually came across a color I liked a lot more for the highlight. And if you look at this, I changed it to be a bit more of a peach. That color is this color, and we mix it quite simply by taking quite a bit of cadmium red, a very small amount of Mars black, not much at all, quite a bit of titanium white. There we have a true pink. Then we'll add a hint of our yellow, hint more of our red, and you can see just how close we're getting there. Almost there. And this works really, really nice because it's a bit more of a soft pigment than the yellow and the orange that we had, and it just works in a subtle way. We have a bit of a moody piece, and by keeping even the highlights a bit more subdued and moody, I think we can really accomplish something with a great atmosphere, something that feels cohesive and incredibly beautiful. So here, yet again, I'm just jumping into the middle of the darker application that we have. This will be slightly easier if that darker application underneath that more red set of streaks has dried, but you can go in even if it's still wet. And I'm just going to take more of these, and I'm also going to skip some areas. So you can see I did it here, where, okay, we have that larger line, then I'll skip a couple millimeters, then I'll skip a couple more millimeters, but a different amount, just so we keep it diverse, skip more, and this way we really spread out those highlights and make it something incredibly captivating. Now remember, in this process you do want to leave slight portions of that red showing on the edges, and the more you build up this highlight, the more thick and bright it will look, because of course we are currently applying this pigment on top of a darker base layer. It's semi-transparent, we do see that darker base layer through it, but the more we build up these pigments, the more notable they'll be. So I'm just going to go over these a couple of times while I also continue to fill out these other highlights. And you can see that I am really jumping around. That's just so that I don't accidentally keep doing the same thing over and over, because diversity is so key. Remember, you want the edges to be semi-transparent, so we apply very minimal pressure as we get towards those edges. And if your brush is a bit damp, you'll really have a much easier job with that. Here we skipped quite a bit of space before adding these in. There we go. You can see I almost start with that larger line. We'll do it again. So I just incorporate all of that pigment. Then when I go in to stretch it to the left and right, I don't have much pigment on my brush, so making those transparent edges is significantly easier. There we are. I'm just going to continue doing a couple layers of this, and then I'll see you for our next set of lights. You know, I just said that I was going to finish these myself, but we did a lot of that with a wide shot just so you could see how all of them were flowing together. I wanted to do some that were significantly more close up, so you know what, maybe we'll do a bit more of this together here. So I started with that longer vertical stroke, then I moved into this horizontal application, and you can see I'm going up and down, back and forth, continuously lifting my brush and then making another stroke, and really relieving pressure as I get towards that left and right hand side. Then there's a lot of pigment, and we'll dance back and forth yet again. I know I am starting to cut a little bit more in the video, but we're at a point where things are slightly more repetitive, and I also want this video to be under 3.5 hours for you. That way it's a bit more digestible, more people can watch and enjoy it. I feel like as long as we do demonstrate each of the techniques and we do it a couple times, then you should have a fairly good understanding and be able to do a great job yourself with a little bit of practice. There's a lot going on right here. That's pretty. I like that a lot. Now the bottom of our painting isn't quite finished. We still do need to add that part right there, a couple little separations in the street, and some highlights on these railings. But while we have all of these warm colors, we're going to head up to the top windows and start applying some light elsewhere. So for the lights up here, we're going to be using both the dark mix that we used for the reflections and the light mix. I'm going to be fairly selective here in the background with where I place these lights, because we have so many down at the bottom, and I don't want it to become overcomplicated. I also don't want to draw the eye too much up to this top area. So I'm just going to kind of look at the reference photo, say, okay, where does this make sense? I can see that in this window on the photo, they're about 1/3 lit, and the other portion is dark. So I'm just going in with this dark pigment initially, bouncing around, and applying all of the applications that I think look right. I'm rotating my brush depending on the size of the window, and I'm trying to make it diverse. We're using the smaller flat-headed brush because, of course, it is fantastic in that it just naturally renders squares and rectangles very, very simply. Apparently this is a very busy floor. There we go. These will be entirely filled in. As you can see, I painted them incredibly loosely initially. The initial idea was that it'd be very impressionistic, at least this set and this side of the building. I'm not sure if I'm going to do that. I really like how the painting looks at this point, but we'll see. I might make it loose in the end. But for now, I'll just return these to a bit more of a rectangular shape. Of course, that rectangle is rotated to a point. It's a bit diagonal. And you do want this to be relatively thick, but right now I'm just kind of plotting in where I want everything, and then I can go back over it with another layer. You can see without the highlights in the lights, so they really do look quite subtle at this point. And that's nice because it means if you don't really love how some of it turns out, you aren't really all that committed to it. It won't be that noticeable. There we go. It's a different type of window we haven't done before. And now we'll take some of our highlight, and we don't have to incorporate this over the entirety of the window. I'm actually going to splash it on in a relatively abstract way. That way it looks like the room is lit in different portions. So you can see I'm being very jumpy with it, some of which are going to be brighter than others. And in the end, this will have a really nice effect. With that, I definitely do need to go back over some of this and give it more of a pronounced look. So I think I'm going to take a minute, do that, and then we'll proceed together. Now we're going to head into the middle of the painting, take more of just our highlight, not the darker base layer, and we're going to fill in these windows right here. And I noticed that this was actually quite interesting on the reference photo, the fact that these were significantly brighter, but still a warmer hue. So we're just going to fill these in. You can see that I'm rotating my brush quite frequently for the situation. Grab a bit more water, a bit more pigment. We can always go back and thicken these if we need to, but that water is going to allow the edges to be nice and sharp. Now, if you do happen to, say, move your brush over it a lot, you can kind of blend that out and it might look like a bit of a glow. So you do have some room to play there, see? Just a different technique you can incorporate. Again, adds to that more moody look. We're also going to take some titanium white with the smallest hint of that pinkish beige, and we'll work in some street lights that are a bit more neutral. Just like that. That way we have some diversity of light happening. And I think these are really nice. Able to apply them in a lot of different spots here. But we're not done with our oranges either. So, from there, I do want to incorporate a bit of a light, so we'll add more yellow to this mixture right here. Move that over to the side, grab some extra black, hint of extra white. We'll place that right there. Do another one right over here. Now this is a bit brighter than what they had in the reference photo, but I think the pop of yellow is really nice, and we're going to add a cab down in the bottom so it'll be cohesive with that. We're also going to mix up a darker red for a stop light that we'll have right here. Then we'll make it brighter. Add more red, add more white, add that in the middle, and then we'll get a lot of white, make it nice and bright. That way we have a build up, we have this glow of red, and then we have the actual pigment. Here we'll just do this, make it a bit more simple, that way the eye doesn't move too far over here. The majority of the light in the painting is on this side, and that's kind of where I'd like to keep it for the most part. So far, so good. We'll also add some orangey red to that light because while I just call it a light to that sign, because while that sign is more of a white, it's going to be receiving a lot of this warmer reflected light on it, and it's going to have a pretty big impact. So make that one more orange. I can tell that this one actually is more of a white, but it's darker, so it'll be a dark gray, like that. Brighten it up a hint more. So here you can see that we're really trying to start working in some diversity. Different colors of signs, different colors of lights, and we're just building. Here I notice that this door is dark at the top. Maybe it's a window. Probably a window. And you know what, we'll do the same for this one. We'll make the bottom bright though. So here I'm really just trying to be very mindful of the reference photo. That way I am ensuring that there's a lot of diversity. But I'm really just trying to be playful and make sure that things are changing and that we end up with a really neat looking piece. Because we were using a lot of very similar colors, and while that's great because it makes them cohesive, makes our piece feel like a true mood in a true world, we do want that diversity. There we go. Now we are quite far in the painting, and something I really like to do is come up with a word. Something that you can write in the comments to note that you made it this far, just to kind of show in a very subtle way that you're one of the dedicated few who really does care about making this as good as it can be. You're not just kind of popping in and skipping through, you're really taking the time to learn. I think that's something to really be respected, and I love seeing how many of you make it as far as you do. So, our word or phrase that you can write in the comments that we'll all know about will be rainy days. So you can either write that as the comment itself or you can work it into a comment. But either way, honestly, congratulations for making it this far, making this happen. I think it's this level of dedication that's really going to make you into a fantastic artist, and honestly quite proud of you. Just adding some scribble in there for the implication of text. I don't want to use real text in this. I think it can become too distracting when we're using loose brush strokes. And then we'll incorporate bit of a highlight to the sign. I think that's a bit too bright, to be honest. Get some extra Mars black in there. That's much better. There we go. So now we are working on those signs and we're just trying to make them individual, interesting. Now this one does have a number on it. I think we'll incorporate that, but we won't incorporate the words. And we'll do it wet into wet, that way it's much more subtle. There we go. Now we're going to take the darker red that we used for the reflection right in there, and I'm going to apply it to the tops of these because they will be reflective, they will be wet, and they'll also receive some of this nice orange pigment. I'm trying to leave a little bit of the almost black showing through, and I might skip a couple areas as well. That way it looks a bit more diverse and interesting. There we are. You can also do the same thing by taking some blue. Be careful when you start working with blues and yellows around the same time because they can mix and make green. So just make sure that your water is relatively clean after this and that your brushes are as well. That way things don't dilute. But here you can see I'm just throwing in a bit of this reflection on the tops of these. We'll have it get more subtle as we move into the back. But just another nice little detail that can make the piece a bit more lively. You can also take some of those darker reds and highlights and throw them into things like the pole here, different umbrellas, maybe the edge of a person. Just splash that color about. Now while we're down here, I actually am going to take some of that darker pigment and we're going to fill in this essentially hyper-reflective strip on the ground here. So we'll work with our darker pigment first. Occasionally we will skip an area or two that might have a hard shadow on it for one reason or another. Maybe it peeled up, or 100 different things could have happened to change it. But I'm using the medium-sized flat-headed brush for this. And we're just crafting some of these lines. Then I'll take the highlight and we'll work this back over portions of it. I'm going to be relatively loose with this application. I'm not trying to cover the entirety of that first dark red. I'm just trying to tap on some additional pigment there, make it a bit more interesting. That way the light looks like it's catching different portions of it and it's missing others. This is a great brush for creating those sharp lines when you want it though. Now we'll take a bit of our black, hint of our blue, hint of our red, and we'll just take out some portions of it. Now with that, if you do happen to go over some of the reflections, just take that lighter pigment that you used for the middle of the reflection and work that back. Keep that very consistent. We want those to overpower that reflective strip. Now in this sign right here and this one right beside it, I'm actually going to write in Radio City as I saw it in the reference photo, and because it's so bright, I do think that it's something that I can't really get away with making a bunch of scribbles like we did on the signs. So I'm going to do that. However, I do think this will probably take me between 45 minutes to an hour just to get all of the line work right. And I don't want you to have to watch me write 2 words for that period of time. So I am just going to explain the process really quickly. I'll show it to you after, and you can fill it in on your piece. I'm going to begin with just a darker orange, like we used for really all of the other lights and reflections. Then in the middle, I'm going to go in with the brighter pigment, and I'm probably going to make it as bright as the brightest reflections that we have down in the street. So we're using the same colors. We're going to be using, well, I'm going to be using the 1/4 inch flat-headed brush because it has a nice sharp edge. And once I have those two sketched in, I'll show you and we can go on from there. So here we are, about an hour and a half later, and I have Radio City painted in there twice. Now, just to quickly go over again how I went about this, I started with a darker base layer for the letters. Then I went over it with a highlight a couple of times because the first time it did end up blending. Then, once I had that all mapped out and dry, I took a little bit of the oranges and lighter pigments that I used for the highlights, and with a lot of water, I just worked a bit of a wash over this right here. Now, this is something that gave it a bit of a glow. It makes it look like the light's reflecting. And just to really show you how I went about this, I took my brush, I made it incredibly wet, grab a little bit of yellow, red, orange. That should do. I went over an area. Again, there's a lot of water. And then I just kind of moved it about like that. There, we're doing it a bit higher up. Now it's really important that when you do that, you make sure that all of your other pigments dry, that way you don't kind of move it about. But that's essentially what I did there. Then I also went over and I just added some extra reddish highlight in the same way to this area, and I added in a couple more windows just because I felt like it was something that I was missing from the reference photo, and I thought it looked quite nice. So with that, it's time that we head back down and start working on some cars. So we're going to start with this car right here on the far left. I'll grab some Mars Black, hint of titanium white, and also a hint of red, I suppose. Then, we'll come in and we'll just block the wheels to begin with. They're a fairly easy starting point. Using this sharp brush for those nice sharp edges. Then we'll come back and we'll work on more of the bumper area of the car. And I don't really want to make these cars exact replicas of what they are. I want more the feeling of them. I think that if we get caught in the detail, this can easily become something that looks too detailed and therefore overshadows the rest of the painting, which we don't want. So here I'm just painting the back of the vehicle. It's not going to be receiving a lot of light because it doesn't have a lot of lights shining on it. But I will leave some openings for the lights and the license plate, as you can see right there. Then as we move to the top of the trunk, it'll get some reflections from the sky, so I'll incorporate a hint of blue and white in there. We'll just work that up. Could be a little bit brighter. This is something you could take significantly more time with, if you'd like to. Making the back windshield that blue with a bit of gray. Now I'm painting the top of the car with almost a black. And it should be starting to adopt some real form here. We'll have the back piece that works around the windows. And as I can see in the reference photo, the front of the car, rather the side of the car, really doesn't have much light on it. So the windows aren't going to adopt that same blue. So just fill that in. It's not going to be as dark as the back, and it'll have more of that value from the trunk right there. Just getting some more water. Mix up a really nice bright gray. And we'll have quite a bit of a reflection right up here. Coming into the back. It'll be on the top of the car as well. You can see that my brush strokes are relatively loose. Grab some red, yellow, black, white. Mix up a similar orangey red to what we've been working with previously. Work that on here for the lights, just building up our base application there. We have a light right here. You can see that it is blending with the previous mixtures, which is okay. It's nice. If it's loose, it'll give it a bit of a glow effect. And then we'll have more light there. There's a bit of a reflection on these areas of the car. So while you're painting this, I'd really recommend not thinking about it as a car or even pieces of a car. Just look for areas of light and areas of dark. Then fill those in as you see fit. There we go. There's a bit of a reflection down here. And a little bit of one right there as well. Bottom of the car, there's a reflection showing through, so I'll paint that. And then we have a miniature antenna, seemingly, right around here. So I'll just tap that on. Make this a bit darker, that way we can differentiate between the top and the bottom of the car. But as you can see, it's quite loose. That's how we want it. There we go. Now we'll just take that same brush, get a bit more yellow, red, quite a bit of white. Mix up our highlight pigment. And work in the light back here. That's really pretty. I like that a lot. Now we're just going to move to this next car Yet again, we're starting with quite a bit of Mars Black, and we will begin by working on the wheels here at the bottom, giving it a slight curve, but remembering that they are on an angle. And then we'll also fill in this bottom piece with this dark pigment. Now, the windows are also quite dark, but not as dark, and they have a hint of blue in them. So we'll mix this up. We'll fill this in. Need significantly more pigment for that. There we go. And then we have a little bar here, and then more window. Good. Now this vehicle here actually has a bit more of a beigey orange pigment, similar to our light, so I'll mix that over here, that way it doesn't kind of get diluted with everything else. And our main color for the mix is going to be white, and then I'll have a hint of everything else. Like that. So we'll start right here. Work around our lights and license plate as we did last time. There we go. Fill in this spot. Now, because our almost black pigment is still wet, we may get a little bit of a blend here, but I'm okay with that. Again, I'm not looking to make these cars, SUVs, vehicles, absolutely perfect. There, I did move over the light. That will happen from time to time, and it's okay. There we go. As long as we remember to put it back. There. Now we'll make a brighter mixture. Significantly more titanium white in here. We'll go to the areas that are a bit brighter. So this right here, the top of it's definitely brighter. And we're just starting to build depth and value in the same way we did our buildings. Areas that are receiving more light get brighter pigments. Darker, more shadowy areas get darker pigments. Now there's actually quite a bit of a orange reflection on the side of the car, so we'll paint that. It's a nice little detail. Wouldn't have thought to add in, but the reference photo had it, and I thought, you know what, that's a great idea right there. So add in more orange right here. You can have that working up the vehicle, and that'll differentiate the back from the side. Then I'll grab more black. Expand the wheel here. Do a second layer. Clean that up. Lots of little strokes in this. Then of course we need our darker light color. Mix that up like that. Just checking my photo, that should go right there. That should go right there. Of course, because we're working next to an almost pink, it doesn't show up to a great extent just yet, but once we build our highlight, I can use that for some highlight. A bit of extra red and yellow. And we'll just do a couple of layers here. License plate looks like a darker reddish orange. There we go. Even though I want these to be loose, I am still picking specific areas to refine. That way it does look like a vehicle from a distance. So here we have a bit of a farther, wider shot where, again, I think it becomes quite evident that even if you use a bit more of a loose stroke and you are a bit more impressionistic with your application, from a distance it will all come together and you will end up with something that looks like a vehicle or a series of vehicles as we have right here. So with that said, now that we see it, we know that it's working, let's jump back into it and paint yet another one. So now we're going to head into this one right here, still using that 1/4 inch flat-headed brush. I'll grab some Mars Black, hint of titanium white, and a hint of our red as well. Then we'll head back in and paint in our wheels as we have with all of our other vehicles. So you're probably starting to recognize some patterns that we have going on here with our order of how we paint these. Starting at the base, starting with the darker values for the most part, and then we build from there. Here we'll have a wheel kind of coming down. It'll interrupt the reflection a little bit. It's okay. Now we will grab a slightly brighter version of that for the base of the vehicle. Right under here, we'll paint more road a little bit later on. It's important not to see that white and then say, oh, you know what? I'll just make that the bottom of the vehicle. If we do that too many times, eventually we kind of end up breaking our piece and we don't want that. Now we'll grab more black, a little bit of white. We'll head up right into the back windshield, which will have a reflection. And the majority of this one's actually going to be orange, which is interesting. So that's something to know. While the way we paint these is quite similar, the order in which we apply our pigments, a lot of our pigments are going to be different on these vehicles. They're going to share similarities for sure, and they're going to adopt a lot of the same colors and reflections, but they are going to be quite diverse. Now this one's an SUV. It has quite a bit of a movement here with the window. Initially I thought this was an SUV taxi because of the colors, but don't believe it is anymore. It's okay though, we're now... Oh, you can't see what I'm mixing. I'll take some yellow, I'll take some red. We'll make an orange, we'll grab a hint of black, a little bit of white. Just keep mixing this until we get a darker orange, like that. And we'll apply this for the base of our vehicle. Right there. We'll also have quite a bit of that pigment over here. I'm still painting loosely, which means I am moving over portions of the wheel now and then, and that is okay. I'm also just mapping out all of the darker areas right now, and the reflection in the windshield is actually quite similar to this, so I'll throw that in there for now. Now we'll start moving on to a lighter orange, so more yellow, more red. Again, more yellow. Take some titanium white. Mix that together. Filming this right now with a bit of a different lens. Generally the lens I use gives me a bit more of a blurred background, which is a nice artistic shot, but this one allows me to zoom in. So when we're working on the smaller portions of this larger canvas, you can see better. However, the issue with it is that I'm simply not used to it. And so occasionally when I'm doing my mixes, I don't have a good estimate of where the camera is looking. But that will come with time. So here we're just filling in all of these brighter oranges. But you'll notice that despite the fact that these are bright oranges, they're not as bright as a reflection. And that's important. We don't want them to be. Otherwise, just going to make a bit of a darker orange again. But otherwise, because this is as large as it is, it would steal a lot of attention, and we don't want that. There we go. I think we'll make this a bit brighter. Again, we're avoiding the lights and the license plate. Make my brush nice and damp. Create good highlight. There we go. Start to build out other interesting pieces of the car, maybe protruding pieces around the wheels, protruding pieces near the bottom, like that. There's a bit of a highlight underneath our license plate, and then there's also a highlight separating two darker values right down here. Now we'll go back to more of a dark red mixture for our actual lights. Don't forget the white. That'll desaturate it a little bit with the Mars Black. Won't make it too strong too quickly. And remember, this is just our base layer to build on top of. It's also worth noting that the license plate here is an almost white, so we'll go with a light gray for that. There we go. We'll have a light up there. I'm just marking it with that for now so I don't forget. But now I'll go back and grab some of our other light colors, work that on. I'll also mix up more of a highlighted orange. Doing a lot of different oranges and pinks here. We'll add a reflection from other lights in cars right there. We'll add one coming down from up here. We can use this to start the highlights in our backlights. And I think we'll make a bit of a dark gray for our windows, right up here actually. Leave a space in between. There's a bit of a highlight on that back window too. Then I'll grab some Mars Black. Don't want to just use Mars Black. A little bit of blue. Craft underneath the car just so we can differentiate that a bit easier. Now the bottom of the car, that back bumper, will probably get lost in the same colors and visuals of the street, and that's okay. Don't worry about that. It'll just make it feel, again, a bit more cohesive. Now that we've given our lights a little bit of time to dry, we can take some yellow, red, quite a bit of titanium white, mix that up. And work that on. There we go. It's a nice car right there. So here we have all three of our brand new vehicles, and as you can see, it's really drawing a lot of attention to the middle of the canvas and giving us some diversity of color, which I really like. With that said, we are now going to hop into the final three vehicles right here. This time, however, I'm going to work on all three at the same time to save a little bit of time, but also because they work with a very cohesive color palette. It's important that while we're diversifying colors in these, that we don't go too far and we don't make this area of the painting feel a little unrealistic or disconnected from the rest of the piece. So while these three are dramatically different, we're going to make these three quite similar. So let's hop into that and keep painting some vehicles. So, pop quiz, when we are painting a vehicle, what do we start with? The answer is some Mars black, a little bit of titanium white, and maybe a hint of red. And this will be great for our wheels. We're still using that 1/4 inch brush. It's incredible how versatile this thing is. Gets those nice sharp lines when we need them. Covers a good amount of space. There we go. And now we'll just make it a hint brighter, like that. And we'll start working into the back bumper area of that vehicle and this one as well. Now we'll get more of that Mars black. These cars are actually going to be quite dark, so you'll see that I'm continuously going back to similar values and pigments. The windows of this one don't have any real light in them, so we'll make that incredibly dark. The back window of this one is a bit brighter in a couple of spots, but we can start it with a dark base. And we're just mapping out very distinguishable portions of these vehicles. There we go. Now the back of this one actually does have quite a bit of light, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to make it dark initially, that way I know where it is and I can continue painting with other pigments. I'll also just map that right there. Now we'll make a bit more of a purple. So we'll take some blue, some red, black, quite a bit of white, a bit more of each. And we'll start mapping in this vehicle. So the majority of it is comprised of this color right here. You can see that it's relatively close to that, but it is a little bit different. It's a bit darker. But because we are using a very simple palette, a lot of this is going to feel quite cohesive. Only going to go to there because below it is the road. And then the majority of the front of the car here is actually highlight, so I'm just going to map in where I want that. Then we'll take this, we'll avoid our back lights, which is essentially going to be there, and our license plate. I am being more loose over on the right hand side here, and that's a purposeful thing a lot of painters actually do, because generally you want the eye more towards the middle of the painting, and you can move the eye by creating sharper, more high contrast subjects, right? That's what it's attracted to. So if you make the edges significantly more blurred or loose, then the eye doesn't tend to stay there, and it's an easy way of just kind of moving attention. With that said, here we're just going to mix a bit of a darker orange, like that. And looking at my reference photo, I think I'm going to move that wheel forward a little bit. Just checking that photo. There's some light wrapping around the back of the tire. Works its way back there. We can use this pigment to map out our lights on our vehicle. Again, more loose over on this one than I am over on this, though I am still being loose with this one as well. Now I think we'll need a brighter version of that purple, so I'll just add titanium white to that last mixture. Because right here is quite bright because this light from this vehicle is shining on the back of this vehicle. We also have some highlight around the windows, and this window in particular actually has a bit more of a blue reflection, so we haven't used anything with a lot of blue lately, which is nice. It'll diversify things a little bit more, but not to a great extent. I'm not going to make it an extreme blue. It's more of a soft blue. Take that and just work it right in there. This one actually has a slight bit as well. Now again, I did want to move this wheel to be right there. Good. We can paint underneath the car with a very similar pigment, just a little bit less dark. Blend that via a series of horizontal strokes down into the rest of the painting. And we can also take this dark pigment to create some extra details here in our other vehicles. Now you could spend, 5-10 hours making these cars perfect, and I think you'd end up with a really beautiful painting. But this is just to go to show that you don't have to, especially when we've been working with more loose strokes throughout the rest of the painting. And this was actually one of the larger reasons why I wanted to do that. I knew I wanted the cars to be a bit more loose, that way there was this slight idea of motion, and it could be this really special thing. There we go. I'm going to make a bit more of a highlight with our grays, because there is some light shining around the back window and the fiberglass or metal that surrounds it. Generally in painting you don't like to outline things, but this is going to be an exception. Just on this car specifically, because of how the light's reflecting. And then I'm going to bump up how bright this is, again because of those lights right there. That's really good. This vehicle is going to remain quite dark, but I'll make the license plate a little bit brighter. Now we'll make a real highlight for our light. So close, right there. And you can see that reflecting down here. This reflection is actually coming from the car right in front of it. And we can add a little bit on this one, but I don't want too much because, again, I just don't want the attention to be over here to a great extent. Adding a bit of that light pigment into this, again because of the car behind of it. Some lights. There we go. Really bouncing around here. Really liking it a lot though. Now we're going to paint our final larger car by taking initially some lighter, well, relatively lighter blue. We'll work that right in between the white down here and the white up here, and this will act as our windshield, just catching a bit of light but not too much. Then we'll grab some extra Mars black, make it darker, and we'll come in for the bottom of the vehicle, which will now separate this, and the new one. Create quite a bit of depth here. I like that a lot. And we'll throw in another vehicle right behind there to fill in that spot. But quick and easy. Now, of course, we do have this building. The majority of the bottom here is going to be almost a black. So I just used quite a bit of Mars black and a hint of titanium white. Yet again, this will finalize an edge for this vehicle right here, which is quite nice. Gives us a sense of finishing something, which I do think is an incredibly cathartic thing on a piece as large as this. Then going to mix up a darker blue, like that, and we'll just quickly work in the bottom of this building. It has a lot of lights, a lot of signs, but I don't want it to be too complicated, so I'm going to simplify my version. Starting with these blues. You can see I'm doing the top. See if we can just work that up there. Here it's a similar enough color and value. Then in the middle, we'll go with more of a dark red. But again, all of these pigments are things we've used quite a bit in the past. And so at this point, it's all feeling very connected. Still sticking with that brush, you can see how I'm cutting along those edges. There we go. That actually worked really well. And the bottom will be a brighter blue than what we've worked with. So, blue, titanium white, and Mars black. See how this looks? It's a little bit too dark. It's a little bit too blue. Or too gray. We need it to be more blue. So we'll go with that mixture. If you ever try something and it doesn't work, just mix right next to it on the palette so you know that you're moving in the right direction. It's also worth noting that I am aware that I'm starting to trip on my words a little bit. And that happens, A, when I've been painting for a number of hours while teaching, but also I find now, just when I get really into a piece, because it is something that, we all love and we get really passionate about, and it's easy just to kind of get lost in the painting process. And that's definitely happening for me right here. I am loving how this is turning out, and it honestly may end up being my favorite lesson on the channel. Definitely has the opportunity. But anyways, here we'll take some extra red, yellow, quite a bit of white, mix up a nice highlighted pinkish orange. We'll throw some lights into the back here. I see a real collection of them in the reference photo, and I'm letting them kind of get lost and blend with the black a little bit, just because it's going to give us a diverse set of oranges, some more bright, some more subtle. And I think that worked out really well. Now, yet again, the text Radio City is on the side here, but we can only see a couple of the letters. So we'll do R, do a loose A, and then have that get lost. Again, something you could spend a lot of time on if you'd like. Maybe I'll come back to it, but right now I do want something a bit more loose because I feel like reading the text 3 times over can be a little distracting. And the bottom here is a bit more loose. Now I believe we have some other words, but they are on a bit of an angle and farther away. So I'm just going to do some loose mark making. Like that. Now we're taking quite a bit of Mars Black and a little bit of Titanium White, and we're moving into the final white spot here on the canvas. And our first subject is a vehicle. It's going to be behind a fence right here. And this is actually really exciting because it is the final open area on the canvas. This one definitely took quite some time, and now we get to reach a big milestone. I'm going to mix a lighter gray for part of the window here in the front, and then I'll add slight highlight down around the bottom, just like that. We'll switch to a highlight for the lights here in the front, just like that. And what I'd really stress about this area here is remember to keep it fairly loose. Again, we're farther away. It's meant to accentuate the piece. It's meant to, give you some extra interest. Say, oh, what is that in the background? Make the world more than just a foreground. And that's really the goal here. We don't want it to be hyper detailed. We don't want it to steal away the attention from all of the people and the vehicles. This is meant to aid the piece, to build it up, not to kind of steal the show. So I'm starting with that darker vehicle. Then I'm adding this fairly muted gray, which, as you can see in the background, actually looks quite a bit like our previous blues. And we're just applying this very basic initial layer, which will build some subjects on top of, but again, subtle subjects. There we go. Sticking with that smaller brush. You can see I clipped the edge of the vehicle there. I actually like that a lot. I brought a bit of that gray over. I think that works nicely. Now we'll create a more saturated, bright version of that blue. So I'll work it right beside, that way I can see the difference. And then I'll start building some highlight that attaches to the previous highlights we created. And we'll just let them kind of get lost as we move into the background. Working back and forth with a Z-like pattern for the most part. Just trying to make it all connected. Then we'll mix a darker gray. It's not extremely dark, but it's definitely darker. And we can start painting in some people. And people at this distance, you might see a limb kind of coming out from a larger body or something of that nature, but really for the most part, these are vertical strokes, little taps on the canvas. I think we could make a couple of them that are closer to us, a bit darker, so I'll add some Mars Black into that mixture. Maybe I paint a little umbrella over one. We can also add vehicles in the application. just a couple little rectangles in the back here. And then as we start to run out of paint, we move farther and farther away because we have more semi-transparent applications. Things look more subtle. There we go. And I think we have another dark subject right here, probably another vehicle. See, it's all starting to come together. Grab some of our highlighted pigments and throw the lights on there. You can throw some lights in the background, but I'm being much more loose with them. You can see that they're not as bright because, again, in the distance, you lose that saturation and you lose that contrast. There we are. Gonna add a little bit of a reflection down here. Just doing more of what we were doing, but in a more loose fashion with less stark pigment. So, as we take a step back, we get to see a final wide shot of our painting. We get to see the entirety of the piece covered in pigment, and we reach a true milestone in the painting process. I always love getting here, and I'd like to note, at this point, all that's really left are touch-ups. It's going to vary from person to person, painting to painting, but I actually did 2 different touch-ups, and I think they really could aid you and your piece, so we'll talk about that quickly. The first was a second bar right underneath our first larger bar. Now this starts right in the middle of the gate and it comes down to right in between this longer bar and the bottom of these gates right here. So it's just a little detail, but I think it really adds a lot to the foreground visually. It's extra leading lines, it's more of a similar subject that creates repetition that just feels really natural. And it was something that was actually in the reference photo the whole time. I just didn't realize it till the end. And that is such a common thing when working with reference photos with just this much detail. It's so easy to miss a spot or two. And I'm actually sure that I missed quite a number of them. But I incorporated everything that I personally felt was really important to the piece. And if you are supporting the channel up on Patreon, I would implore you to really comb through that, incorporate all of the pieces that you love, because this is a longer lesson. This is going to take a while to paint, and when you do spend this amount of time on something, it's worth it to really make it exactly how you want it. And speaking of how long this took, this probably took me cumulatively about 12-ish hours. The video will probably be between 3 and 4, but that just really goes to show you the amount of detail, care, and effort you can put into something like this. And while I was going through this painting process, I did learn how to kind of simplify different processes so they don't take as much time. So in the future, when we are doing more city scenes like this, I can include more of the actual footage. We don't have to cut up as much, and that will be a process. The more of these we do, the more I'll be able to include, the more I'll be able to articulate quickly and kind of render at a better speed. So this was the first big cityscape on the channel. I've been wanting to do this for probably a year now. I think I actually had a reference photo that I wanted to work from back in February, and ever since I've just been kind of trying to figure it out. So I'm so glad that we finally did this. We took the time, we made it happen, and I realized, kind of just went off on a tangent there, I did do another little touch-up. That was just a bit of a vignette effect. So I took quite a bit of Mars Black, a little bit of our Cerulean Blue, a lot of water, and I did a wash to that building, that one, a little bit down there, and a little bit just right over this grate as well. And that way the eye went more towards the center of the piece. It ensured we did get this darker border. And if you're unfamiliar with a wash or a glaze, you're essentially just
taking very, very thin pigment with a lot of water and applying it over a pre-existing subject. And it's going to leave a lot of the line work and the detail. It's just going to change the value and color a little bit. You could alternatively also just kind of repaint those lines with a darker pigment. I did do that for a portion of it and it works just as well. So it's up to you and how you personally like to paint and work. But I would recommend ensuring that the corners of the piece are a little bit darker. With that said, I would like to say a big thank you to you for making it this far. Honestly, if you are 3 to 4 hours into a lesson, it means it's something that you really care about. It means it's something that you've put a lot of thought and time and effort into, and I have no doubt that you're going to end up with a really fantastic piece if you really do take the time that we spend here, you invest that into your painting. You are the type of person who is going to succeed. Good for you for putting the time in, good for you for continuing to learn, and for being really invested in the process. With that said, I would also like to say a big thank you to the patrons over on Patreon. As I always say, this channel is primarily fan-funded. This lesson happened because of you. There is no way I could have spent 12 hours on a painting in a week if it wasn't for you. Now it's time to edit. That's going to take quite some time. And again, that also couldn't happen without you. So thank you for making this happen. Thank you for supporting the channel. Everybody who watches these lessons, they get to watch them because of you and because of your support. That's what you're doing. You are providing these lessons for thousands of people, and that's a wonderful thing. You're also making it so I can make a living teaching art, which is something that's a really good gift. So thank you. I hope you feel like you learned a lot through this. I hope you feel like you're really growing as an artist. And I hope you feel incredibly inspired to go out and create your own cityscape. Also, as per usual, if you are new to the channel, remember you can also support the channel up over on Patreon. Up there we do have the traceable, the reference photo, which I do feel are very useful in this lesson. I also have 5 different ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which again will teach you about glazing, what brushes to use, how to work with composition, really everything you need to know before you jump into your first acrylic painting. We also have an exclusive Facebook group where we all kind of share artwork and help each other out. And I also do personal critiques and a bunch of other fun things like that. So go check it out if you're interested. The link is in the description. And also, as per usual, again, if you're new, remember to subscribe and hit the bell button. That way you're notified when the new lessons go live each and every Saturday. I will see you next Saturday with a brand new painting lesson. This was honestly such a pleasure, and I can't wait to get started on the next one with you. So thank you so much, and above all, as always, stay creative.